What's up?
Hello?
Is it the real John Smith or just a fan?
Sorry, what?
Just messing with you. What's up?
Oh, hey.
I was asking if it was really you or just a fan. Sometimes there are fans who try and pose as whoever they're a fan of. I just had to be sure. But it sounds like it's the real Agent Smith.
Oh, yep.
Yup. So, we've got Pact in position to receive and administer questions to Agent Smith. So if you have a question, you can type it in the Twitch chat, and then she will deliver those to him in the Discord text chat. I don't know if you figured out how to do that, but in your Discord client, there's a Agent Smith text chat in this channel. I think if you click that, you could see what Pact is typing at you. But to kind of get the ball rolling, one of my favorite things that I've talked about with you in the past is the France-Germany interaction in World War II, especially the story of how Germany kind of rolled in and won really fast, and how a lot of people have a very stereotyped approach of, oh, French people just love to surrender, they're very weak and all this, rather than kind of taking it from the military perspective of maybe the German tank commanders just kick ass and are amazing.
Yeah, so the impression is that the French just built a wall, basically, and hid behind it, the Maginot Line. And that the Germans just went around it. That's basically what happened, but it's not an entirely fair representation of how the French lost. The Maginot Line was a very expensive project the French developed over the course of the 1930s, and maybe into the 1920s, I don't recall exactly. But it was originally intended, I think they had plans anyway, to make it go, to extend it all the way to the Channel, along the border with Belgium, but eventually the money gave out and French politics kind of interceded in that. And it wasn't originally thought to be too big a problem, though, because the Belgians themselves had some of the largest forts in the world in the southern part of their country. I don't remember what the name of one of them. One of them was particularly well known, particularly large, imposing fortification complex. And the French, for their part, were prepared. They were expecting the Germans to make an effort to go through Belgium. It's not as though it was a complete shock to them when it happened in 1939. And so the original plan was to have garrison units stationed along the Maginot Line, and then to have their most mobile units held in reserve, along with the British Expeditionary Force. And when the Germans moved into Belgium, they would take that reserve force in conjunction with the BEF and rush them forward into Belgium to meet with the Belgian army, and then try to form a line that would hold the Germans. So they had a plan in place and expected that development. What they had not expected, and what the Germans really hadn't even really expected, was that there would be an attack through the Ardennes, through this very heavily forested region, sort of around Luxembourg. And even the original German plan to invade France didn't involve moving through the Ardennes. It was rather a plan developed by, let me see, I believe it was Erich von Manstein, who was one of the best German generals in the war. He's not as well known in the West because he mostly fought on the Eastern Front. Generally, people in the West are more familiar with Rommel, for example, because of North Africa. So von Manstein sort of went to the Ardennes forest and basically found that it would be possible for armored formations to move through it if they were careful and if they picked the route right. And he was the one who developed, I think it was Operation Sickle, which was the plan to use that as a vector of surprise, use it to launch a surprise attack that caught the French military and the British off balance. Their whole plan had been focused on thrusting into Belgium, and the Germans kind of just skirted that. And so that was enough to catch them they were so out of position basically for that they couldn't ever really respond in time. With the result being that the Germans got into their rear, and the French were never able quite to catch up. And the Germans just boxed them in against the channel, leading to the eventual evacuation at Dunkirk.
And then the flip side of them actually deciding to surrender, it has a little bit of connection to France's kind of humanitarian approach to things, where it's not so much about like establishing honor and just dying to your last breath, kind of like the Japanese did in World War II. That was more of the opposite approach, where it's like, all right, we're losing now, so let's just give them as much hell as possible as we're dying. The French were kind of like, no, you won. It's a technical win, so we'll give it to you. It's fine. We surrender.
Yeah, the perception in France was that it was over. You know, in World War I, the Germans had never made it as far as they did in the opening month or two of the Operation Sickle. And there was a sense that, given that the lines had been broken so thoroughly and that the French army was in such disarray, that there wasn't much sense in continuing. I mean, why keep fighting if you've obviously been beaten? The idea of retreating to North Africa and continuing a long, desperate war to retake France was seen as absurd. You know, the German army had clearly won, so the war's over. Just be done with it. And it didn't help that the French political status quo at that time was very divisive. And there actually was, I don't know if we ever talked about this, there was an offer, I think it was made by somebody in the British government, it might have been Churchill, I don't remember exactly. But the offer was basically to create a unified French and British state, a sort of binational unified state. And the idea there was to offer that as a way to keep the French in the war, you know, instead of sort of the de facto alliance. There was still some mistrust between France and Britain at that point in time. So creating a binational state was seen as a way of creating a rock-solid alliance. You know, this is how dedicated we are to you. Mm-hmm. But there was some consideration of that by the French government, but ultimately it fell through. The French government fell apart not long after the collapse of the French line, the front line, and the fall of Paris. And at that point, I believe it was a French general who kind of de facto took charge of the government. And the head of the French military, the leaders of the French military were very pessimistic at that point. And they didn't think there was any way, even if they did keep fighting, that they could win. They thought that Britain, without the French army fighting in France, would surely be defeated, that it was just inevitable that Britain would lose and have to surrender at some point. So there was sufficient pessimism and political discord that there was just no chance. It wasn't seen as a viable option to keep fighting.
See, now you know. There's the fun sort of carryover from World War II alliances and rivalries, and how that kind of translated into the soccer world of like who hates whom and that sort of thing. It's like the I don't know, the casual way of people kind of holding those prejudices in a little bit of a sports capacity. We don't actually want to kill you, but if you go to one of these soccer games, we'll beat you up. We'll call it good.
Yeah. Yeah, hooliganism in soccer has a long tradition, and a lot of it is predicated on nationalism. You know, nationalism in Europe after World War II kind of had a very negative connotation for obvious reasons. So soccer was kind of the only place where that energy could be directed legitimately. Yeah, the Russians, I think. There was a thing, I think, somewhere I saw that talked about Russian hooligan clubs that would actually practice fighting so that they would be ready during the games. There was a big, I don't know. I'm American, so I don't know anything about international soccer tournaments or whatever you guys call them, but there was a big one. I think it was in Italy not long ago, or France, something. And there was a huge outbreak of violence. There was this huge brawl outside of the stadium, and I think Russians were the principal perpetrators of that. And did you mention a text chat somewhere?
Yeah, in Discord, there's a a chat just titled #Agent Smith, and if you join that, then questions from the chat can be directed to you.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, I don't see it listed under text channels anywhere.
At what point did Vichy become an issue?
Oh, there it is. Okay, yeah, now I see it. Vichy become an issue?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, like in post-war France, when did that kind of become a political issue, or when did the Vichy government take power? I mean, it didn't take long for them to take power after the surrender. The agreement that was signed with the Germans was basically that the Germans would occupy the northern stretch of France. And it was a strictly military occupation at that point. But the rest of France would not have German occupation. And all of France would still retain nominal independence, nominal autonomy. And I think Vichy... Oh, now it's been too long. Let me think. Was Vichy the general or the city? Now I can't remember. But yeah, the Vichy government, the Vichy French government, whatever it was named how it was not quite a puppet government. Those were legitimate French politicians. They did have to kowtow to German demands generally, just because of the disparity in power and in accordance with the agreement signed after, the French stage of the war ended. But they were very conservative people. One of the big divides in France up to that point has been between the left, principally led by Labour, and the conservative right, which was socially and economically conservative. And with the left out of the way, owing to the post-war agreement, the right felt comfortable setting up a semi-authoritarian state. Well, I guess I shouldn't say semi-authoritarian. It was a pretty authoritarian state. And they got to implement all of their policies, all of the right-wing policies that they'd been wanting to implement but hadn't been able to because of the necessity of a liberal democratic government and political pluralism, all the difficulties of getting anything passed in a democracy. And it was a very retrograde period for France, owing to that the conservatism of that government. They even changed the country's motto. Yeah, what is it? The French motto has always been égalité, fraternité, liberté, something to that effect. I don't remember the proper order. And then it was changed completely by the Vichy government into something like fraternity, religion, and paternalism, rather, religion, and something else that I can't remember it off the top of my head. But yeah, it was a difficult period for French liberals and certainly for French leftists. And that lasted up until, what, 44, thereabout, after D-Day? D-Day and Operation Dragoon in the south, which, the lesser-known operation, also an invasion of France from the south that nobody hears about because it wasn't as dramatic. Pushing up from the south of France from Operation Dragoon and then south from the D-Day landings, France fell in pretty short order, a couple of months. And at that point, the Vichy government was summarily overthrown. And there was a period of not insubstantial retribution. There was a lot of score settling in the aftermath of the liberation of France. So I'm not sure if that answers his question.
This is really interesting. I've never been so intrigued by history. Yeah, well, there's a lot of stuff that happened, and most people, unless you've specifically dedicated time to studying something in particular, there are a lot of surprises. A lot of oversimplifications, like for us standard non-historian folk after the fact, of like, oh, this is why it was this way. Where the real answer is pretty much always longer, more interesting, and less straightforward.
I don't know if I could do. Somebody mentioned the Battle of El Alamein.
Hmm.
I don't think I could do it in detail. I just remember rough detail. You know, a lot of the stuff I talk about is just from memory, and a lot of it I read about or studied a long time ago. So it's I have to equivocate a bit. It's not going to be like really detailed. El Alamein was a significant battle in the campaign for North Africa, and I want to say it happened just before or during Operation Torch, when the United States and Britain invaded northwestern Africa, which was sort of the turning point in the North African campaign. That was when the Allies kind of finally got momentum and eventually were able to eject the Axis from North Africa. Uh, the lead up to El Alamein was kind of a stalemate. If I'm remembering it correctly anyway, the British and Germans had kind of been sitting at each other's noses for several months after a very strong German thrust into Egypt. I think El Alamein, the actual city, is just inside the border of Egypt from the border of Libya. And there was a period where there was a real fear on the part of the Allies that Egypt would fall and that the Germans would push into Cairo. And they were stopped. Maybe that was, again, this is all very ambiguous on my part. But basically, the British outnumbered the Germans, but we're still very concerned they would lose because General Rommel, who was the commander of the Germans at that time in North Africa, had proven very, very effective at ingenuitive use of his armored formations, and he was very adept at using flanking maneuvers out into the open desert to surprise the British flanks and turn them. And he'd done that several times up until that point. So the British this time were kind of more prepared for that. They had good use of minefields and had formations off to their left in order to guard their flank to make sure that they were ready for when that happened. And I think eventually, I really don't remember if the British launched the attack initially or not. But I do remember that the Germans eventually did launch a thrust, their trademark armored thrust, and were deflected. Yeah, honestly, I'd have to read more about it to get any more than that. It's been too long. But that was the Battle of El Alamein was a significant battle for the British because that was the first. It wasn't the first defeat of Rommel in North Africa, but it was the first big one. And I don't think from that point forward that the Germans ever regained initiative on the eastern side of the North African campaign. I think from there the British were able to just push solidly west into Tunisia and meet up with the Americans that were pushing eastwards from Morocco and Algeria.
I remember watching with you the TV piece on Germany and Italy in Africa, North Africa, and kind of the difference between the Italian and the German units, just what they were capable of doing and expectations and training and all this quality of equipment.
Yeah, the German military was much better trained and equipped than the Italian military by a country mile. The Italians had actually entered World War II, and I want to say, it would have been 1940, and it was late in the war at that point. Germany basically fought France almost by itself. I don't think they had a lot of allies at that juncture. And then after they had already broken through the French lines and had basically defeated France, that was when Italy declared war on France and kind of jumped in and tried to invade southeastern France so that they could get a claim on some territory in the peace agreement. The funny thing is that they actually didn't make any real headway. The border between France and Italy is heavily mountainous, and even though the French military was caught off balance, most of their military was deployed northward to fight the Germans. The few French units in the southeast were actually able to stop the Italian invasion. So the Italian effort was a bit humiliating, and they didn't end up with a lot of leverage in the peace negotiations that followed. So that's just an example of the quality, so to speak, of the Italian military. It did not perform well during this period. The other thing they did after that, after the defeat of France, they declared war on Britain also, and they actually successfully ejected Britain from its East African holding in British Somalia. At that point, Eritrea and Ethiopia were both Italian holdings, and they were able to launch an offensive northeast from there into British Somaliland, and north from Somalia, which I think was also Italian at that time. And for a while, it looked like the Italians might invade Egypt, push north from Ethiopia into Sudan and Egypt, and attack them from there, while also at the same time attacking eastward from Libya. Libya at this time also being an Italian colonial possession. And so it was thought that Egypt might be under threat from a two-pronged assault from the Italians. Nothing ever really came of it. The Italian push from Libya was pretty quickly defeated by Egyptian forces stationed in Egypt. And Italian forces moving north from Ethiopia never really made any headway. They never really were resourced properly. The British were pretty quick in responding to the Ethiopian threat by mobilizing South African troops. South African troops and a few East African troops, colonial troops basically, from some of their other holdings. And with those troops, they were able to contain the Italians in Ethiopia and eventually conquer them. And retake their East African holdings in the process. And so that's why you never hear about East Africa in World War II, really. The Italians were pretty much the only Axis presence out there, and the British were able to defeat them pretty quickly in 1940, or maybe early 41. Again, memory is a little ambiguous on that. Yeah, I think with Vichy, with North Africa, one of the interesting questions that I thought was neat was how did the United States and Britain invade French Northwest Africa without having Vichy France declare war on them? I'd always kind of wondered about that. You know, when you hear about Operation Torch and the invasion of North Africa, you just kind of assume, okay, everything they invaded was just Axis territory held by the Italians or the Germans, and so no big deal. But actually, most of the territory, Morocco and Algeria, that was invaded in Operation Torch was actually French. And French at this point was technically still an independent country. It was technically a non-combatant in World War II. So effectively, Britain and the United States invaded a neutral country. And yet Vichy France did not declare war on them. It did not enter the war on the side of the Axis at that point. And part of the reason for that was some deft diplomacy on the part of the United States and Britain. They actually they didn't tell the Vichy French this was going to happen. They didn't want to give them forewarning. But there was some questions about how they might react in terms of North Africa, what would happen there. One of the ways that got around it was by claiming that, you know, if we did take North Africa, your North African holdings, we would hand it over to the Free French, which claimed to be the French government in exile. I don't think anybody really recognized them as such, but the Allies did, and so they said that, okay, we're not going to take these territories from you. We're just going to hand them to the Free French, and if we win the war, we'll hand them back to you. And so on that count, as well as lingering enmity towards the Germans, the Vichy French kind of held their tongue. They complained about the violation of their sovereignty in North Africa, but they never jumped in to the war like you might think they would.
What impact did the World Wars have on the British Empire?
Oh, that's well, they pretty much ended it. that's the short answer. Yeah, World War I pretty well bankrupted Britain. You know, it cost a lot of money, and they had to borrow a lot from the United States, among other creditors. And the British Empire was already really expensive by that point. In fact, it was costing the British government more money to administer India than they were getting back in tax revenues. And that was before World War I even started. That was late 1800s, early 1900s. And so they were already kind of hurting for that. You know, the British economy at that stage in history was already starting to become relatively uncompetitive compared to emergent industrial powers. Germany was becoming an increasingly powerful industrial economy, and a lot of traditional British industrial firms could not compete. And up until that point, Britain had a free trade regime. They had their perspective and philosophy was, let's just have free trade and we'll prosper. But a lot of British industries were starting to lose market share to German industry, among others. You know, there were other, I mean, the United States even was another example. And because their economy was starting to become relatively less competitive, it was also starting to suffer a little bit. It wasn't performing as well. And so the British government was not getting the tax revenue it needed in order to maintain a lot of these British colonial possessions. So the British Empire was already in decline even before World War One had started. It was just getting to be not only expensive but politically unpopular. Left Labour political forces in Britain did not see a lot of benefit to them to maintaining the British Empire. They thought that money would be better spent on labor and labor benefits, welfare benefits specifically. So World War One, when it broke out and was waged over the course of, from 1914 to 1918, the British government had to borrow a shit ton of money in order to maintain the war effort, because they couldn't. It was too much for them. It required so many resources. So by the end of the war, they were near bankruptcy, and the 1920s in Europe was actually a period of great poverty for them. There was here in the United States, where I live, the 1920s is remembered as a period of great prosperity, because the war really didn't impact the United States very much, and it damaged so many of America's competitors, major industrial competitors over in Europe, that the American economy was able to kind of pick up the market share and do very well. But over in Europe, it was the complete opposite. There was a severe depression following the war, and it kind of lingered through the 1920s. And so they were especially badly hammered then when the Great Depression in 1929 hit. So through the 1920s and 30s, the interwar years, Britain really struggled to find the money in order to kind of maintain empire, but there was not yet the political will to end it. There were still plenty of conservatives and special interests in British politics that still pushed for it. And that's about when World War II hit. And it was basically the same deal. I mean, Britain could handle World War I, but could barely skate by. And World War II hit, and they couldn't manage it financially, and they needed heavy American help, especially after the fall of France. Lend-Lease assisted with that significantly. I mean, the British Army was, at least the British Expeditionary Force in France, was basically destroyed. I mean, they managed to evacuate a significant number of personnel, but almost all of their equipment was left in France. And so the British Army almost had to be rebuilt from scratch after the fall of France. And even that alone was a significant, investment, required a lot of resources. So they were in bad shape by the end of World War II. It was bad enough by the end of the First World War, but World War II was basically at the point at which, one, they were completely out of money, and two, British politics had shifted to a point where Labour had enough power that they could basically say, all right, we're not going to do this anymore. We need to cut costs, and one of the ways we're going to do that is to end the empire. Another factor in the end of the empire after World War II was NHS, the National Health Service. One of the big planks of the left Labour political campaign in the elections after World War II was let's have a national health service, nationalized healthcare rather. And that was enormously expensive. That was a huge burden on the British government's budget. And so not only was the British government hurting because of the war and all of the money they had to borrow, and not only was there now a lot of sympathy for ending the empire because of the ascendancy of the political left, now there's also this greater budgetary pressure. This need to pay for the NHS necessitated enormous cuts in other areas, and a lot of those cuts came out of the part of the budget that had gone towards maintaining garrisons and imperial possessions. And I might also add that the United States played a role in the end of the empire as well. At the end of World War II, British power was sufficiently undermined that they needed American help in order to continue to play a global role, a role that diminished over time, eventually more or less ending sometime in the early mid-70s. And the United States, as a condition of its support, basically demanded the end of the British Empire, an end to European empire in general, basically. There was no love for European empire in the United States. And actually, before the Cold War, the United States was known as one of the preeminent anti-imperialist nations. Owing in part to the Revolutionary War, but also to liberalism. Sort of the state ideology of the United States is kind of liberalism, so to speak. And so there was no real desire on the United States to help European nations maintain their empires. And so when it came to negotiating continued American involvement in European affairs, which was itself a big debate, there were lots of Americans who wanted to just retreat to the traditionally isolationist role the United States had played in world affairs through most of its history after World War II. And so as part of the trade-off for American support and a continued American role in maintaining security in Europe after the war, European empire kind of had to be curtailed and eventually ended. The American argument was self-determination, which had been one of the big planks of the American position after World War I. But because the United States was not the biggest player in World War I, the United States didn't have as much leverage to push that. After World War II, the United States had a lot more leverage to push that, and it pretty much got its way. So just a lot of factors came together. The World War II made the U.S. the global hegemon instead of Britain, and American political preferences were dead set against empire. And it's a little more complicated than that. The European empire did not fold overnight, and America, to a degree, had to prop up European operations. And that's a whole other conversation we could have, though. But the American role, the financial cost of the wars, all kind of combined to, pretty much put an end to that great liberal British Empire, as they like to think of it.
Why was Germany unable to invade England?
Well, they certainly wanted to. That was Operation Sea Lion. Was the German plan to invade Britain? Yeah, the plan was to subdue the Royal Air Force first. That was the first stage of the plan, because they didn't think they could do it unless they had command of the air. And then once that was done, then they were going to launch a seaborne invasion. And they never were able to get past that first stage. That was the principal problem. And it's debatable, too, whether or not even if they'd done that, they could have pulled it off. I mean, the Royal Navy is a beast. That was one of the largest navies in the world at that time. And so the Germans would have struggled a bit to deal with the Royal Navy in the event of an attempted invasion. But without air support, the Royal Navy would have had a hard time of it. So that's kind of debatable. But regardless, the Germans didn't want to even try unless the Royal Air Force had been sufficiently crushed. And so I guess the short answer to that question is the Battle of Britain is why. The course of the Battle of Britain. That air war was kind of the last line of defense, the goal line defense of Britain, so to speak. That kind of saved them from that invasion. I think the British did produce a documentary, what an invasion of Britain would be like. It might be somewhere on YouTube. You can look it up sometime. That was pretty interesting. The British government certainly thought they were in for an invasion, and they were preparing for it. They were mobilizing, I think it's called the Home Guard over there, and arming people and preparing people to wage some kind of guerrilla war. I don't think there was a great deal of optimism that they would win in the event of an invasion, but they were going to make an effort. They were certainly going to try. And the Germans would have suffered a terrible cost. I think they were even planning on setting the ocean on fire around the landing areas. The idea was that they would pour oil and gasoline into landing areas where they thought the Germans would land, and they would set it on fire during or just before the landings. Yeah, they had the British have always been very innovative and inventive in their wars. So they've always got some harebrained scheme that they've got going. It's one of the neater aspects of British military history. I don't know if the guy asking that wanted to get really into the Battle of Britain, but that's also pretty interesting. The Germans really very nearly won the Battle of Britain. They were actually quite close. The Germans, at the beginning of the Battle of Britain, focused very narrowly on attacking Royal Air Force bases. And the idea was that they would just wear down the Royal Air Force over time. And that strategy was actually working. The problem the British had was not so much a lack of planes. The attrition there was replaceable. They could buy and produce enough planes to replace the planes that they were losing. The problem was pilots, specifically experienced pilots. You can replace pilots, but the new guys you get are generally new. And the new guys would get chewed up really quickly. I think the life expectancy of new pilots was maybe like a week or two or something like that. It was very low. And very few people, in turn, had time to gain the experience necessary to be good pilots and to combat the Germans. The Germans, meanwhile, had been training the Luftwaffe for years. They'd started building up their air force way back in the Spanish Civil War when they sent people over as quote-unquote volunteers. So they had a good-sized reservoir of pilots ready to go, experienced guys. The Royal Air Force, not as much. They kind of had to build up very quickly once the war started. And so from a weaker position, they started suffering attrition that they could not deal with. And they even had trouble, given that they took people from the Empire, from the Commonwealth. They took pilots from Canada, a few American pilots snuck over, pilots from the Caribbean, South Africa, some Indian pilots even, a lot of Polish pilots actually. After Poland fell, there was a very large contingent of Polish fighters who wanted to keep fighting the Germans. And they would go on to fight in Russia for the Soviets as part of the Polish Home Army. And then a number of them also managed to get to Britain and continue to fight there. And a good number of them actually fought in the Royal Air Force as pilots, where they were known for being courageous and a little bit crazy. But they were really on the ropes there for a while. And then what changed, what kind of really saved them, was kind of an accident almost. There was a British bomber that got lost during a bombing raid and accidentally bombed Berlin. And that was a big deal. Up until that point, the British and the Germans were not exchanging, city bombing raids. That was kind of considered taboo. One of the things everybody was afraid of before World War II was that cities would be bombed in mass bombing raids. And so there was kind of almost a gentleman's agreement, if you will, that cities would not be bombed like that. Obviously, that was violated in some cases. Rotterdam was famously bombed terribly at the beginning of the war. But in the case of Britain, the Germans hadn't done that yet. And so it was considered a violation of that agreement, that de facto agreement, when the British accidentally bombed Berlin. And the Germans, of course, did not think of it as an accident. And so that was, I think, Göring, who was the head of the Luftwaffe at that time. It was either Göring or I think it was Hitler, actually. He had a speech after that in which he said, for every bomb dropped on a German city, there will be 10 bombs dropped on a British city. And so there was a big retaliation. The Germans launched a huge bombing raid on London. And so then, of course, the British retaliated, and then the Germans retaliated, and thus began what the British called the Blitz, which was this long campaign of bombing targeting London. And that was a very difficult time for Londoners, as well as British and other cities. The Germans didn't just attack London, it was also other cities, but they in particular had a focus on London. But because they did that, it took the pressure off the Royal Air Force. The Luftwaffe wasn't focusing as much on Royal Air Force bases and Royal Air Force radar installations. And that gave them a breather that they really needed, and they were able to recoup from that and kind of recover, and eventually they were able to reach a kind of stalemate. And that was sufficient to prevent the German Operation Sea Lion, the German invasion. They called it off after a couple months of that.
I remember us talking about that. In StarCraft terms, it's sort of like when you have an opportunity to be on top of the enemy's production, like they were targeting the Air Force and preventing Britain from really keeping pace in that sort of exchange, and then the accidental bomb on Berlin, and then Hitler gets pissed off and they start choosing the wrong target that allows Britain to get back in it. Whoops.
Yeah, there's a really good documentary series about World War II called Battlefield. It's made by the British, of course. And they have a number of episodes about a number of different aspects of the war, and it's very detailed. And I think I actually watched some with you, actually, a couple of them. Mm-hmm. And one of them is Battle of Britain, Battlefield, Battle of Britain. And I highly recommend anybody interested in World War II, well, watch the whole series for one, but especially that Battle of Britain episode. They go into great detail, the Battle of Britain. So that I highly recommend that. Yeah, another reason the Germans lost the Battle of Britain is they changed their tactics. They actually, originally, German bombers would fly in with a fighter escort, and that fighter escort was given a lot of discretionary decision making. They could peel off and go and dogfight pretty much whenever they wanted. Or even just go hunting, even just go on a patrol to try to find a Royal Air Force contingent and just fight them there. One of the things that changed was the German Air Force forced them, because they were taking losses too. There was a lot of attrition in the Luftwaffe over this time period as well. They were just better able to withstand it because they were had more resources, more manpower, etc. So one of the changes made to try to protect the German bombers was that fighters were made to stay next to the bombers. They weren't allowed to kind of wander like they had before. And that kind of also helped the Royal Air Force, because then they could kind of ambush them, surprise them, or avoid a fight if they weren't up to it. And so that also helped them a great deal. That's sort of, I think it's somewhere in the middle of the Battle written. I don't remember exactly. Somebody was asking here about how Germany became a nation state from a series of city-states to a strong nation. I don't know that I know enough German history to kind of go into detail from the beginning, from the city-states, because you'd probably have to get into the Holy Roman Empire and that whole medieval era to start there. It kind of started with the Napoleonic Wars, because before then there hadn't really been a German national identity. But with the Napoleonic Wars, one of the after effects of the Napoleonic Wars was the spread of liberalism throughout Europe, to parts of Europe that hadn't really been as exposed to it. Napoleon, say what you will about Napoleon, but he was a liberal emperor. And wherever he went, whatever area he conquered, he would introduce liberal reforms. And even after Napoleon was defeated, a lot of those liberal reforms were retained on the part of returning monarchies, because they were afraid rescinding them would aggravate the public too much and lead to revolts. And one of the after effects of the introduction of liberalism, I mean, there had been some liberalism in Germany before, don't get me wrong, I'm generalizing, but one of the after effects in particular of the Napoleonic Wars on Germany was the emergence, or rather the ascendancy at least, of a German national identity. And from that point, German liberals started pushing more and more for a unified German state. But of course, Germany was divided into a number of kingdoms, and none of them were particularly keen on losing sovereignty, and so there was a lot of resistance for a long time. And eventually, what happened was that two Germanic states in particular became very powerful, Austria and Prussia. Austria had already been powerful for a long time. Prussia was more still emerging as a power. And in the late 1800s, it was kind of expected that at some point some kind of unification would happen, but it wasn't certain whether that unification would happen under Austria or under Prussia. And it was thought that it would be either or. Either the German nations would be united under one or the other. And there was a competition between the two for a while for supremacy. Prussia got the upper hand, I think, with the Austro-Prussian War, I think it was called, and that was in the 1860s or so. Somewhere around there. And then after that, after Prussia kind of had the upper hand and was able to kind of draw in the smaller German states into an economic union, a sort of a trade union, kind of like the early European Union was mostly just a tariffs union, that was how Prussia drew in the German states around them, the smaller German states. And then I think the real leap forward happened with the Franco-Prussian War, in which the Prussians partly instigated. The French were technically the aggressors in the Franco-Prussian War, but actually they were declaring war because of a perceived insult that a Prussian diplomat had sent. And that was actually partly staged because they were hoping France would declare war. And the reason they wanted that to happen was that so they could rally German states together and kind of cite France as an example of a common threat that would serve as an excuse to initiate unification. The message being that, if we want to survive in Europe against big states like France, we have to unify, we have to fight together. It's the only way we can survive over the long term. And that message had resonance because for a long time, France was sort of the boogeyman of Europe. France was enormously powerful in Europe through the 1600s and 1700s. And then, of course, basically took over Europe in the Napoleonic Wars. And so everybody was very concerned about, French power and what France would do on the continent. And France was kind of in decline by the 1800s, but that sort of memory of France as this all-conquering, threatening power resonated. And so when the Franco-Prussian War came out, that just sort of confirmed their fears of an aggressive France being a perpetual threat. And then after the war, which the Prussians won pretty handily, that's kind of another conversation, the Prussians pushed hard for these smaller states to agree to a unified state, and they did, and they agreed to that, partly from the experience from that conflict. And from that point, it was pretty straightforward. I mean, they all agreed to form a unified state, have a national parliament, and I think around 1875, I don't know the exact year, the unified German state was created, and so that was the birth of modern Germany. It's actually a very young state. It hasn't been around that long. Only from that, somewhere in the 1870s is where that unified German state came from. Oh, this is neat. Did Germany ever reach its maximum manufacturing potential in World War II? That's an interesting question, actually, because Germany was not on a total war footing until 1943. The Soviets went total war footing right away. You know, and by total war footing, I mean complete mobilization of the country. Complete mobilization of all industry, human resources, whatever. All of it was partly or directly controlled by the government and directed towards the war effort. So just total concentration of resources on the military and producing military resources and directing personnel into the military. That's a rough description of total war, a total war footing rather. And the Soviets did that pretty much right away as soon as they got into the war. The British did it pretty quickly. The Germans, not so much. They kind of half-assed it a little bit. For them, for one, they weren't expecting to go to war in 1939. They thought the Western Allies would just lay down and let them annex Poland. So it was actually a bit of a surprise. Well, it was a surprise for Hitler and the upper echelon of the Nazi Party anyway. Here's some interesting trivia for you. The Nazi military and the Nazi intelligence apparatus totally expected the Western powers to declare war on Germany after the invasion of Poland. And they thought Hitler and the Nazis were absolutely crazy to invade Poland. They thought it would lead to the destruction of Germany. And that actually turned out to be a prediction, but it didn't pan out the way they thought. They thought that if France and Britain declared war on Germany, that they would roll over Germany. Because the German military in 1939 was not quite ready for a huge conflict. It was still building up. Everybody kind of talks about how Germany built up its military in the 1930s. That's true. But it still wasn't quite up to snuff by 1939. Obviously, they had enough power to roll over Poland. But a conflict with France and Britain, that was seen as a stretch. And the German high command was very afraid that they would very handily lose a war. And that's what they thought would happen. They thought, okay, we go to war with Poland and that's it. We'll just lose. Britain and France will jump in and crush us. And so they were as shocked as anybody when France fell in a matter of months. For them, that was incredible. And it actually gave Hitler a lot of political capital, too, amongst his critics. Because his critics had all said, there's no way Germany can win this. This is completely stupid. And then Poland falls, France falls. Oh, now we're masters of Europe. I guess Hitler was right. Who knew? Yeah, so that gave the Nazi Party a big shot in the arm in terms of political popularity. And because the German military had not been quite ready and had still won, it wasn't seen as necessary to mobilize totally for war. And there was on the part of German intelligence, it wasn't thought that the Soviet military was in any shape to fight. They knew about the purges of the Soviet officer corps in the late 30s, which had wiped out, just great swaths of the Soviet officer corps. So most of their veteran leadership had been lost. And in conjunction with that, there was just a general disrespect for communist government. It wasn't thought that communists would ever be able to organize and sufficiently and field modern equipment. That's also partly a disrespect for Russia. They didn't think the Russian technology would ever be at par for a German military, basically. And in general, they just didn't think it would be a big deal. We'll invade Russia, and then they'll collapse, and then that'll be the end of it. And so, with that kind of logic, why have total war mobilize? Why mobilize for total war? It wasn't quite seen as necessary. So, that logic lasted through 1941. It lasted all the way from 1939 up through 1941, and they still thought like that even after the disaster outside of Moscow in late 1941. The Soviets shocked them in a lot of ways in 41. It wasn't thought that they would ever be able to field the kind of resistance they did. Certainly the Soviets took a lot of losses. There was a huge learning curve for the Soviet Union in the first couple of years of the war because they were not ready by any stretch. One of the things they had done after World War I is they had implemented this policy where soldiers would vote on orders. So if you were a Soviet officer in the Red Army, you couldn't do anything too controversial that your men wouldn't like because they could actually turn on you. And another policy in the Red Army was that political officers, commissars, had equal power with officers, formal officers. And if the political officer didn't like an order or thought an order was unnecessary or had any kind of issue with an order from an officer, they could negate it. They had a de facto veto. So that just sums up one of the ways that the Soviet command structure was dysfunctional in the first couple of years of the war. I think it was a matter of months before those changes specifically were overturned. It was pretty clear that officers needed more authority in the field if they were going to go toe-to-toe with the Wehrmacht. And those changes were made, but it took a long time before the Soviet officers had enough experience and had learned enough fighting the Germans to kind of be able to meet them on an equal footing. And they took a lot of losses in the meantime. That's a really hard way to learn how to fight a war, fighting a war for survival against one of the most powerful military machines in the history of conflict. But they pulled it off, to their credit. You know, the Eastern Front is a whole other thing we could get into. But specifically with regard to the German economy, yeah, they never bothered to go total war until after Stalingrad. The Battle of Stalingrad was kind of the breaking point for them. That was the point at which they figured, okay, this is seriously going wrong at this point. We need to go all in. And so from early 1943 on, that was when the German government really started taking control of the economy and started focusing resources into the war effort.
Why is Ukraine still fighting for independence from Russia, and why won't any major powers help?
That's well, Ukraine has independence from Russia, so I wouldn't say they're fighting for independence. I think it's more fighting for, I guess, sovereignty would be a better way to put it. Russia never really stopped thinking of Ukraine as part of its sphere of influence. And there are a lot of cultural similarities between the two, and a lot of cultural affinity between people in Ukraine and Russia. Ukrainian and Russian are mutually intelligible languages, for the most part. There are some differences. Yeah, a lot of that stems from the Crimean issue from 2014, I think it was, 2014, when Russia invaded. Maybe that's too controversial. Maybe I shouldn't say invaded the Crimea. Effectively, they invaded Crimea and took the province from the Ukrainian government. And I mean, that's a complicated question. One of the problems Ukraine has is that a lot of its natural gas comes from Russia, and the Ukrainian economy is not sufficiently modern or efficient to provide heating. Most of the heating in houses in Ukraine comes from natural gas. And what Russia did was over the past 20 years, they actually started selling the Ukrainian government gas at a discount, a steep discount even. And they didn't really do that out of brotherly love. What they did that because they knew that they would be able to, at any point, jack up the price. If the Ukrainian government ever did anything they didn't like, they could just pop up and say, oh, we have a pay dispute now. This discount is too steep, we need more money. And of course, if the Ukrainian government did something they liked or was cooperative, well, then suddenly, okay, we'll give you a deeper discount now. That's fine. And they never explicitly linked discounts with the Ukrainian government and its actions, but it was implicit. And I don't think anybody in Ukraine, or certainly Ukrainian politics, suffers under the delusion that Russia wasn't using gas as a political weapon, or at least for political leverage in Ukraine. So a lot of Ukrainian nationalists are of the mind that, even that alone is an example of how Russia has outsized influence. Another problem was the color revolutions. And this is kind of a meandering answer, so I apologize. This is kind of all over the place. In 2004, there was what was called the Orange Revolution. And there had been a guy, I don't think I remember his name. There was a guy who had been president of the Ukraine for a long time, basically from independence up until 2004. I hope I'm remembering this right. And he was very corrupt. He was a very prototypical post-Soviet politician. Very much an insider, very corrupt, etc. And there was a big liberal kind of protest movement against his rule in 2004. And that eventually resulted in him losing the subsequent election. And there was an attempt on the part of what was called the Orange Coalition, which was a coalition of different parties in Ukraine who wanted liberal reform and who wanted to move more towards Europe in terms of foreign policy and in terms of the design of their political economy. And that coalition was very dysfunctional. It did not operate very well. There was a lot of personality conflicts. I think technically the leader was a guy named Viktor Yushchenko. And he found himself at odds a lot with a woman named Yulia Chulishenko, I want to say. I think you're She was a kind of a gas baron. She was sort of a pseudo oligarch, but she was also a populist. So the coalition between the populist, whatever her name was, I don't remember, and then the liberal Yushchenko, that was the Orange Coalition. But there were a lot of disagreements about things like economic reforms. Populists don't generally like liberal economic reforms, and so there was a lot of tension from the attempt by Yushchenko to implement those reforms. So eventually, there was another election in 2012, I want to say, and that election saw the Orange Coalition voted out of power. And what was the coalition that took their place was called the Blue Coalition, I think. And that was a very pro-Russian political coalition that was heavily funded and influenced by oligarchs in eastern Ukraine. Eastern Ukraine is a lot more ethnically Russian and has a lot more ties economically to Russia. So people in eastern Ukraine tend to vote much more for pro-Russian parties. They voted, that was the voting base of the Blue Coalition. And the leader of that coalition was a guy named Yanukovych. And he had strong ties to, strong economic ties anyway, to Russia. And he wanted to he didn't want to place Ukraine firmly in the Russian camp. He wasn't like pining to join CISTO, which is sort of the Russian equivalent of NATO. It's a common mutual security agreement where basically a mutual defense agreement, I should say, between Russia and a number of countries. Yanukovych was never pushing to join that. And he wasn't pushing to join the Eurasian Economic Union. I think that's what it was called, which was a tariff union that Russia was trying to push amongst certain Russia and certain post-Soviet states. But Yanukovych and the Blue Coalition, I might also add, wanted Ukraine to be independent. They wanted to lean more towards Russia, but they still wanted to retain independence. Ukrainian politics is dominated by oligarchs. And if you're an oligarch, you want to maximize, your wealth and protect your wealth from political rivals. And in the case of Ukraine, the best way you do that as an oligarch is making sure you're independent. Because if Russia has a lot of influence, they can lean on your business. They can say, all right, you're an oligarch, you own this business, you need to give us a certain amount of certain share in your company, or we're going to cause trouble for you. So if Ukraine is sovereign and independent and minimizes Russian influence, or at least mitigates it, Ukrainian oligarchs feel more protected. And that's a common theme you see regardless of the kind of oligarch you're talking about. There are some Western oligarchs who are more pro-Western. So the thing Yanukovych did that prompted the mass protests in Kiev, I think they've come to be called the Maidan protests, was that he pulled out of an agreement with the European Union that would have set Ukraine on the path to eventually join the European Union. It wasn't even an agreement to join the European Union. It was actually a preliminary agreement. There are a couple of stages countries have to go through before the European Union even considers a country for membership. And that was the agreement that Yanukovych pulled out of. And he kind of did it surprisingly. There was supposed to be a meeting at which the agreement was hammered out and finalized. And then I think right after that meeting, he had a meeting with a Russian government official. And then right after that meeting, he came out and said, oh yeah, we're pulling out of that agreement. So the optics of that were terrible. Declaring that right after the meeting with the Russians just made him look like a Russian puppet. And a lot of people in the Ukraine, especially the people who were more pro-Western and wanted to liberalize the economy, cut back on corruption, and saw the reforms necessary to join the European Union as a way to reform the Ukrainian economy and to cut back on corruption. For those people, that was enormously disappointing. And that was the genesis of the protests and the subsequent events. The Russians were of the mind that Yanukovych was overthrown by the Maidan protesters, and the Maidan protesters were revolutionaries supported by Western governments as part of a conspiracy to pull Ukraine out of the Russian sphere of influence and into the European or the Western sphere of influence. Individual perspectives on that depend on your politics. So the Russians kind of saw it as an opportunity to jump in and get Ukraine. They saw the unrest in Ukraine, and they saw the Ukraine kind of slipping out of their grasp. And so they thought, well, to hell with it. Let's just get in there and take Ukraine. Who's going to stop us? The Ukraine was not a member of the EU. It wasn't a part of NATO. And it had no mutual defense agreements with any other states, at least none that I know of. So there would be no other state that could kind of bail out the Ukraine and, save them from the Russians, so to speak. So it was a great opportunity for the Russians. And they took that. And that's kind of how they got where they are today. So that's more what's going on than fighting for independence. It's not quite fighting for independence. It's more fighting for sovereignty from Russian influence, at least for some people. Again, Eastern Ukraine is more ethnically Russian, and they don't have so much of a problem with Russian influence, although that might be starting to change. A lot of people have gotten skeptical about Russian actions in the Ukraine owing to there were two republics, separatist republics, that were formed in eastern Ukraine. And it was kind of expected that Russia would annex them as part of Russia, as new provinces, oblasts, and would do all it could to help them achieve independence from Ukraine. It actually did not do that. And it was actually, Russia seems to be pretty content to kind of let the conflict between those separatist republics and the Ukrainian state drag out. And that actually soured a lot of people, I think, even ethnic Russians in Ukraine, on Russia, because it looks less like Russia is a sympathetic partner that wants to help them, and more like an opportunistic country just taking advantage of instability. As far as why won't any major power help, partly it's because the cost doesn't really mesh with the cost is greater than the benefits. You know, again, Ukraine is not in any kind of Western alliance that would obligate anybody to come to their aid. Russia is very powerful and has an edge in terms of operating in the Ukraine because of its proximity to the Ukraine, and also because a lot of people in Ukraine are ethnic Russians and are relatively sympathetic to Russian interference. And the prospect of a conflict in a country like that is so close to Russia and so subject to Russian influence, is not appealing to foreign nations, you know, even the United States. I mean, on the part of the United States, there's real question about what does the United States gain by helping the Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine will always be subject to heavy Russian influence. So any effort on the part of the United States to kind of come in and try to pry them away from Russia is going to be very difficult. And the most that American politics has allowed thus far is some support to the Ukrainian government thus far. That's about as much as they can hope for, I think, because there's just not a lot of impetus on the part of the U.S. government to intervene. There's no U.S. interest, basically, in the Ukraine. You know, the only reason the United States has taken what action it has is because the United States is the global hegemon, and it's seen as having a role in promoting global stability. And because Russia's actions were seen as violating another sovereign state's borders, thereby violating, you know, international norms regarding sovereignty of independent nations, for that reason alone, the United States was sort of expected to go and quote-unquote do something. And so just in deference to that role as global preserver of the peace, so to speak, the United States has taken action. But beyond that, I don't think it'll do much more. I think if there's more action, it'll be done by Europeans, since Europeans kind of have more of the stake in that. It's been a while since I've thought about the Ukraine, so that's not as in-depth of an answer as I would like to give, or as that he probably wanted. But yeah, that's kind of the gist of it.
Do you think the deciding mal-decision was to not take Moscow, but instead head south first for the Caucasian oil fields from the German POV?
Yeah, I've heard that. That's one of the big questions from the Eastern Front, is could the Germans have won, and what was the turning point? And a lot of people home in on the aftermath of the Battle of Smolensk. The Battle of Smolensk was kind of the first major battle that the Germans got bloodied. They won the Battle of Smolensk, but the Wehrmacht really took heavy losses, and that hadn't been the case up to that point. And so there was a question about, all right, if resistance does get heavier from here, what do we do? We can keep pressing on Moscow, but we took such heavy losses in Army Group Center that there's a real possibility that we'll get bloodied again and that there will be a stalemate. On the other hand, we can take what resources we have left and split Army Group Center in half, and send one half north to try to end the siege of Leningrad, finally take the city, and send the other half south to try to help out Army Group South. And Army Group South at that point was moving through the Ukraine, was kind of lagging behind the other two army groups. It had not made as much progress as quickly. And so there was a big gap. Army Group Center's southern flank, its right flank, was heavily exposed because Army Group Center was not on its flank like it was supposed to be. And so there was a fear that the Soviets would launch some kind of offensive into Army Group Center's rear, attacking that exposed flank. And that made the idea of pushing south and helping Army Group Center more attractive. that was a big debate in the German army's high command, and I think Hitler intervened eventually and said, you know, these army generals are being too risky. You know, they're leaving their flanks too exposed. We should kind of consolidate our position. Certainly, German commanders in the field, in Army Group Center, really wanted to push on Moscow. That was their desire, and they were all, you know, part of the reason for that is that they were all gung-ho tank commanders. I think the guy in charge of the primary Panzer Army in Army Group Center was a guy named Guderian, General Guderian, and he'd actually helped pioneer Panzer tactics, armored thrusts specifically, Blitzkrieg for that. Yeah, he pioneered Blitzkrieg. And so he really wanted to keep pushing. You know, German tank commanders were always very aggressive and always thought that you should always be pushing into the enemy's rear and destabilizing their front line. But he was overruled, and Moscow became a secondary objective for a while. It was subordinated to Leningrad and Kiev. So if they had pushed on Moscow, could they have taken it? I don't know, because the Red Army was in bad shape at that time, but also they were very quickly mobilizing manpower and resources. One of the things that shocked the Germans in the first year of the war, and will actually shock them throughout the war, was the Soviet ability to generate new units. You know, the Germans would blow through and annihilate, you know, just whole Soviet divisions, armies, and then they would think, all right, well, we've crushed them this time. You know, we just have to push on and we win. And then they would encounter a whole nother slew of Soviet divisions and armies that seemingly came out of nowhere. And that speaks to the Soviet ability to mobilize their manpower very quickly and get them to areas of the front where they were in need.
And they were basically Zerg.
Yeah, kind of. Certainly in that first year. And they had the Soviets did have a pretty good set of reserve forces arrayed around Moscow. And if they had pushed on Moscow, they would have run into them. And keep in mind also, the fighting would have probably run into the Rasputitsa, which is sort of this rainy season in Russia. And one of the things that happens during this rainy, it's like September, October, I think, when it happens, something around there. One of the things that happens with all of this rain that comes in is that the roads turn to sludge. And Russian roads are, actually, they're still kind of bad, but even then they were very bad. The Russian infrastructure was not really up to snuff. And a lot of the roads that the Germans had on their maps that they were using were not really paved roads, they were kind of dirt roads. And when the Rasputitsa came, when the rainy season came, all of those roads became virtually impassable. So the Germans had pushed on Moscow after the Battle of Smolensk. The fighting probably would have lasted into the Rasputitsa. And there's it may have been that the Soviets could have surrounded them. It could have surrounded them because they would have been cut off from reinforcements largely. They wouldn't have been able to get people up there. So, I mean, it's an open question. You know, you could kind of go back and forth on that.
Do you have insight into the shell game the kleptocracy has played with Ukrainian banks over the last decade?
Yeah, that would require a greater knowledge of Ukrainian politics than I have. I don't doubt that it's happened. Ukrainian oligarchs are very crafty people. They're very good at moving money around as they need. I don't know of any specific issue, or I haven't read anything specifically about shell games and the Ukrainian banking system.
What is shell game? I don't know what that means.
Well, even that's a good question. I think in this case it refers to where the money is being. I think that's what he was referring to anyway. Maybe I'm wrong. But I think it refers to laundering of money and moving it around to different banks in order to hide the fact that you have laundered all of this money from what was probably Ukrainian government sources.
Mm. How does the fact that all currencies are linked to Americas influence global politics? Could you give a bit of history about global trade in post-America pre-World War days?
Pre-World War II? No, that's...
They might mean pre-World War I. It didn't say which war. They might have meant both.
Well, I mean, the global trade regime, as it relates to the United States, is radically different post-World War II than pre-World War II. So that's an important distinction. As far as currencies are linked to America's influence in global politics. Well, okay, let me maybe I can address that if I'm understanding the question right. There is this sort of notion that one of the underpinnings of American global power is its currency and the fact that it's a reserve currency. And that, some people suggest that it's only the world reserve currency because of oil and because the United States puts pressure on countries to use the US dollar. Certainly that's part of it. As far as the petrodollar, oil being denominated in dollars, that does help the US currency. And I don't think the United States really pressures countries to use the US dollar, though. I don't think that's accurate, but it kind of all misses the point. It misses the point of what a reserve currency is. Reserve currencies are solid, reliable currencies that you feel safe putting your money in. So if you're a major investor, or even if you're not a major investor, if you just have money that you want to be safe, you want it to be denominated in currency that you do not think will be devalued or that will be very erratic. And so the higher risk that there is of a currency being devalued, or rather the higher the perceived risk that a currency will be devalued, the less likely that currency, or more accurately, assets denominated in that currency, will be a reserve currency, because people will be very risk averse when looking for safe assets to invest their money in. So the US dollar is considered the safest because it is so stable. There's not a lot of currency fluctuations with the dollar. And more to the point, it's a very safe place to invest your money because of the US political system. And the US political system is considered one of, if not the most stable in the world. And it has a reputation for respecting property rights. Property rights are sacrosanct in the United States, so you're not likely to see your assets seized or nationalized for some political reason. So because the US economy is stable, and because the US political system has such a high, because the US political system is perceived to have such a high regard for property rights, the United States is seen as the safest place in the world to invest your money, to save your money. And so institutional investors, merchants, traders, anybody who has a lot of money they want to save and be safe, the safest place they can put it is in the United States. And so for that reason, the United States has the world, for that reason, the US dollar is the world's reserve currency. And that doesn't have as much to do with the projection of American power. In fact, if anything, it's one of the determinants of American power. The American military power derives from its economy, and the US economy derives its power from its stable political system. Its political system has a reverence for property rights and liberal economic ideals of economic management. So because of that kind of stability, the US dollar is considered supreme, which is why a lot of talk about the renminbi kind of usurping the dollar isn't very likely. I mean, if you invest your money in China, there's considered to be a lot of political risk. You don't really know if the political system or the legal system will protect your investment in the event of a dispute. And you don't really know, even if your partners, if you have partners in China, they may just decide to stab you in the back. They may just decide to take all of your assets, to take control of the business. It's just a very opaque business environment in China because the political system and the legal system are themselves so opaque. So for that reason, investors are not likely to see China as a really safe place to put their money in the future. Just because the economy is so large in China, the renminbi will have a global role as a reserve currency, but because it's not considered a particularly safe currency to invest in, I don't think it'll ever, at least in the short to medium term, I don't think it'll usurp the US dollar as reserve currency. So maybe that's what he was asking. I'm not sure if that's kind of what the question was geared towards, so I apologize if not. As for trade regime, before World War II, the United States was very insular, and its politics were kind of more defined by labor politics. And for a while, I mean, I'm speaking strictly early 20th century. I mean, the entire history of American international trade policy is pretty broad, and I couldn't give you a really good detailed description of it. One of the defining characteristics of American foreign international trade policy in the interwar years was the Smoot-Hawley Act, which was a act passed in response to the Great Depression. There was a lot of desire, a lot of political pressure in the United States after the Great Depression to protect American markets, to protect American producers from foreign competition. And the popular idea was that if American producers were protected from foreign competition, they would be more successful, they would produce more, and then they would hire more people. And it was thought then that the employment problem would be solved. Obviously, that's a very flawed argument economically. And after the act was passed, it not only damaged the American economy and worsened the Great Depression, it actually worsened the global economy. And a number of economies in Europe and the rest of the world were grievously damaged by the passage of that act. And economists, even now, they'll kind of point to that act and say, well, that's what happens when you really curtail international trade. That's kind of their cautionary tale, so to speak. So international trade for the United States was very much a function of internal domestic American politics before World War II. After World War II, when the United States became a global hegemon, well, there were two hegemons. The Soviet Union was the other one, but the United States was the preeminent global hegemon, such that it was able to create the international trade regime. And it defined that in terms of liberalism. It was a liberal international trade regime. And there was a sense that the United States had to make some sacrifices in order to engineer and propagate that regime. And certainly there was a lot of people in the United States that did not want that. They didn't want an international trade regime that was free trade, liberal, etc., because they didn't want the competition. But it was passed because it was seen as a greater responsibility of the United States as the preeminent power to create an even playing field for nations. And it was also seen as a kind of gift, a kind of injection into Europe's economy, which was badly struggling at that time. It was thought that if Europe's economy did not recover, then communists would for sure take over, and that the United States would be ejected from Europe, and that Europe would fall under Soviet control, or de facto Soviet control. So for those two reasons, the United States really pushed hard a liberal international regime and kind of sidelined its own domestic political considerations. And that had been pretty much the case up until recently. I mean, the Trump administration is kind of the first American administration since World War II to really challenge that liberal international trade regime that the United States and its Western allies created in the wake of World War II. And so that's a big development. That if that continues, that'll be a significant historical change, and that'll be that will mark the 2017 as a significant year in the history of global economics and global politics. Oh, somebody's asking about NATO East expansion. Yeah, this is a big problem for Russians in particular. Russians are of the mind that Eastern Europe is their sphere of influence and that NATO should have never expanded there, and that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe is a flagrantly aggressive step. More to the point, there was an agreement made in 1990. James Baker, the U.S. diplomat, I don't know if he was head of the State Department, I can't remember or not, but a high-ranking U.S. diplomat met with the Soviet envoy, and they had a big discussion about what Europe would look like after the Cold War ended. And at that point, it was thought that the Cold War would end with the Soviet Union intact. Nobody expected the Soviet Union to collapse. That shocked everybody. Nobody saw that coming just at all. Even veteran Soviet watchers couldn't believe it. Certainly the Soviets weren't expecting it. But the Soviets and the United States were looking to kind of wind down the Cold War, reduce tensions, and kind of normalize their relations in the late 80s. And that led to a meeting discussing what would happen to Eastern Europe, which at that point the Soviets were pulling their military out of. They didn't want to have to incur the cost of stationing the Red Army in all of these eastern satellite states. And there was a question about what would happen to them. Would NATO expand into Eastern Europe and have these countries as being part of NATO? And the Soviets really didn't want that. They considered that to be an aggressive move, and they wanted to have a buffer zone between the Soviet Union and the West. And the United States agreed to that. The thinking was, yeah, that's a small price to pay to kind of draw down the Cold War and reduce the likelihood of a thermonuclear holocaust. And so that agreement is kind of cited as an example of American duplicity, because obviously after the Soviet Union collapsed, a number of Eastern European countries were initiated into NATO, and including some former Soviet states, some former Soviet republics like Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and yeah, I think those are the principal ones, were integrated into NATO. And that was considered very disconcerting for a lot of Russian nationalists and from the perspective of Russian strategy, because Estonia, if you look at a map, is pretty much right next to St. Petersburg. And the Russians were not at all comfortable with the prospect of having NATO all of, probably 20, 30 miles from their second largest city. I don't think it's an entirely fair criticism, though. The agreement made with the Soviets was made kind of with the assumption that the Soviet Union would continue to be a great power. And when the Soviet Union ceased to exist, it was kind of, that changed everything. That changed the entire layout of politics in Europe. I mean, that, again, it shocked everybody. Nobody saw it coming, not even the Russians. And so with that change in the equilibrium in Europe, it was thought that, okay, well, that agreement is void. There's, one of the parties that agreed to that is no longer there. The Soviets disappeared pretty much. And so it was thought that Russia would be an ally in the future, and that, if Russia is a liberal democratic country and it will integrate with Europe over the long term, what difference does it make if NATO expands east? What's the big deal if the European Union integrates these countries? If Russia and the West and the entirety of Europe are basically unified under liberal democratic ideals, what's the harm? Was kind of the thinking. And you can call that was probably optimistic and maybe a bit naive, but optimism was kind of the order of the day. The Cold War had ended, the Soviet Union had collapsed. People were pretty, very optimistic that the future was very bright, and so the thinking was, yeah, let's expand these liberal institutions and kind of encompass as much as possible, and everything will be gravy, and there will never be any more problems anymore. It'll be the end of history.
Hooray.
Yeah. So that they were blinded by optimism, I think, a bit, and when Russia eventually did kind of retrench a bit into, whatever you want to call what they have now, illiberal democracy, if you like. Once that happened, the fact that NATO had expanded east became an issue, because the Russians no longer saw themselves as allies of the West. They saw themselves more as rivals. Not necessarily enemies, but rivals. And so NATO expansion eastward, from the perspective of a rival, is certainly very disconcerting. So that's kind of my perspective on Eastern expansion. There are some realists in the international relations field who believe that the United States should not have expanded east, not because of Russian concerns, but more because the United States didn't have any interest in doing it. Taking on allies like that, the United States is required to defend in case of a conflict. That's a big obligation. And if you are going to sign a mutual defense treaty with another country, you really want to make sure that that country is stable and doesn't have a lot of enemies that you think are going to pick a fight with them, or that you think that they'll pick a fight with. So having good, strong allies for realists is a precondition to a mutual defense treaty, and a lot of realists were critical of the United States agreeing to allow these nations into NATO because they are smaller and weaker and so subject to Russian influence. And on that grounds, they're very critical. Make of that what you will. There are a lot of different perspectives in international relations about how countries should project power and how international relations should be conducted. Realists are more of a state of nature school of thought. They think that nations should use their power to gain as much advantage as they can, and they think that that actually would result in a more stable international theater and more international relations, because there would be a balance of terror. There would be a kind of equilibrium. Yeah. And on the other hand, there are more liberal thinkers who think that cooperation should be the goal, that international relations should be institutionalized in agreements, bilateral agreements, or multilateral agreements, and the construction of institutions like the UN or the European Union, etc., to manage relations, to ensure that they don't get out of control, to ensure that nations have strong enough ties that war becomes relatively unattractive. Those are kind of the big reasons I can think of off the top of my head. But yeah, there's certainly grounds for criticisms of NATO expanding east, but on the other hand, you have to keep in mind the context of the era in which it happened, which was very different than the context now. It's a lot of questions now. Can you speak to the relationship Roosevelt, Stalin, and Churchill had during the war? That's an interesting question. So Roosevelt knew that he had the leverage in the relationship with Churchill. There's a big difference between the relationship between the Western allies, Churchill and Roosevelt and Stalin. Churchill and Roosevelt were very close. They saw themselves as natural allies, as being kind of part of a common Anglophone heritage, Anglo-Saxon heritage, and so they clicked pretty well. But at the same time, Roosevelt was very cognizant of the fact that the United States was significantly more powerful than Britain, and that Britain really needed American help much more than the other way around. And so their correspondence is very familiar, very friendly, but Roosevelt did not shy away from asserting American preferences and strategic interests. Stalin, in turn, was they had a hard time dealing with him, in part. Churchill was very mistrusting of Stalin. He saw him as a communist totalitarian that was duplicitous and would be willing to lie and manipulate to get what he wanted. And so there was very little trust there. Roosevelt, in contrast, was also skeptical of Stalin, but he thought that if they treated Stalin as an equal and incorporated him into their planning process and negotiated with him in good faith, that they could reach an agreement, a post-war agreement that would be acceptable to all parties. Roosevelt, and really the Allies' plan for the post-war period in general, was to split the world up into spheres of influence and to have the principal power in each region of the world be responsible for maintaining security within that sphere of influence, within that region. And that probably wouldn't sit well with a lot of smaller countries who may not like who they're assigned as their regional policemen, but that was thought to be the way to ensure peace afterwards. The UN was kind of meant to be a meeting ground for great powers, regional policemen, so that they could get together and negotiate differences between them.
A Justice League.
Yeah, a kind of Justice League of great powers, if you will. It was not really meant to be a venue to criticize regional powers for misusing their power. Each regional power was supposed to get a lot of discretionary decision-making in how they maintain peace. So nobody was particularly surprised when the Soviet Union imposed communism in their sphere of influence. That was no great shock, but that was considered part of the cost necessary to pay in order to reach a peaceful international order after World War II. Where was I going with that? Oh, right, the UN. So, international order. Churchill, Stalin, and Roosevelt. So the thinking was that Stalin would find that arrangement appealing if they treated him as an equal. And Stalin, for his part, well, he was duplicitous and lying and manipulative, so he basically tried to maximize the Soviet Union's gain as much as he could. But there were limits to what he could do. Soviet power was restricted, certainly compared to the immense resources of Britain and America. So he agreed to what he thought he had to. And in the post-war period, he took whatever he could get, and the Soviet government's attitude after the war was sufficiently ambiguous and manipulative that it eventually contributed to the breakdown in relations between the Soviet Union and their former allies in the West, and that kind of precipitated the beginning of the Cold War. Not really. That's not a great answer to what their relationship was like, and that kind of hits the highlights, I think. And I'm sure somebody more well versed in that particular history could probably give you a better answer. But yeah, that's kind of my understanding of it. If I had to choose one World War II country from the major powers whose army you would control, which would you choose? That's a neat question. And he writes, ignoring all political viewpoints. So I guess he's asking which army was the most effective, which army was sort of the best. You kind of can't argue with the German army. The Wehrmacht was probably easily the most efficient, most effective, most well organized. Here's the thing about the German army. The thing they did really different was to give their officers a lot of discretionary power in terms of how they carried out their orders. Sort of the French model, and this is kind of a military science question, so this is more just my basic reading. But sort of the French model of command and control of organizing a military, which was adopted by the United States and also Britain, is very hierarchical. It's very top-down. So you have a general, a high-ranking officer who gives orders, and then lower-ranking officers follow those orders to the letter. And that doesn't leave a lot of flexibility in terms of how to carry out those orders. The German military, in contrast, had a philosophy that emphasized objectives. So if you're a high-ranking German military officer, you wouldn't say, okay, I need you to do this in this order, in this way. You would say, all right, here's your objective. Go take that by such and such time. And then you would leave it to your subordinates to kind of figure out the best way to do that. And that was a very effective way to allow creativity and initiative on the part of your officers. And it also kind of played to their strength because lower-ranking officers are generally more aware of the terrain they're operating in than higher-ranking officers. So they're more able to spot opportunities quickly as they arise and take advantage of them. Whereas in sort of the French-American model, it's more, okay, I see an opportunity, I'll notify high command and ask them if I can take advantage of it. And of course, by the time they get back to you, that opportunity may or may not be there. To be fair, it also worked for the Germans in particular because they trained their officers very well. They had a strong military tradition in Germany, specifically in Prussia, rather. And those officers, they had good officer training schools. They had that, sort of military tradition, military ethos, and it all combined to produce very highly competent officers whom, when given the chance to be creative, when given the chance to take initiative, they would take it. They were competent enough to be able to take advantage of opportunities as they arose, and to be able to identify those opportunities, and to be able to really exploit them. So German officers were just very good, elite. German equipment was very good. German troops were very well trained, rather. And it all just came together really well for them. Yeah, the Allies kind of had to rely on quantity rather than quality in order to defeat them, as well as just German hubris. A lot of mistakes, strategic mistakes on the part of German high command, and Hitler's own interference into the command process. So someone is interested in hearing about the next 30 years of nation-state competition. Quote, with an eye to the themes of economic slowdown, technological displacement, demographic trends, and especially cultural, philosophical factors. End quote. Yeah, we're at we're kind of at a turning point in history. This is sort of a new historical epoch we're entering. The post-World War II period and the international order that was created thereafter is kind of, I don't know if it's going to end, but it's certainly facing a lot of challenges now. And at the very least, we've reached a point where there needs to be a sort of new agreement. There's probably going to be a new international order that's going to be negotiated at some point in the next 20, 30 years. Actually, yeah, over that time frame you specified specifically. It's hard to project that far into the future, though. A lot of things can change. I mean, look at fracking. How many people really saw fracking coming, and the geopolitical implications of the United States becoming a major producer of oil again, or at least a significant producer of oil relative to its imports. I think the United States does the United States still import oil? I'm not sure. I remember fracking kind of certainly curtailed it significantly. But regardless, fracking has been a significant factor in changing the geopolitical landscape across the world. So that's an example of a significant change that can happen almost out of the blue. I'm sure if you were into technology in the oil industry, you probably saw it coming. But I certainly wasn't. So I'm not. Those kinds of variables are just really hard to factor in. In terms of the economy, yeah, technological change is creating a lot of automation, and there's going to be a lot of turmoil over that. I don't know enough about what form technological innovation is going to take and what impact exactly it'll have on the economy. That's another unpredictable factor. But one thing I think you can count on is that there's going to be a lot of political upheaval on account of it, because there's going to be a lot of disagreement about how societies handle structural changes in the economy produced by changes in technology. And it's anybody's guess how that turns out. It's hard to predict. I would like to think that liberal democracies are in a better position to handle it, just because they have more open debate. But even in a liberal democracy, the kind of political tensions generated by the economic dislocation caused by major changes in how the economy operates, and major changes in employment and industries and sectors, even in liberal democracies, those forces are hard to deal with. And I don't know. That's something to watch. I wish I had something more substantial to contribute to that. I guess the real question for now is whether or not liberal democracy can withstand those forces, because those forces are already in play. We were kind of talking about this last Sunday, how a big source of discontent in Western politics right now stems from structural changes that have been caused by free trade agreements, by globalization, by liberal economic reforms over the past few decades. So there's this question about how much legitimacy has liberal democracy lost over that time span, and does it still have enough to continue on as the predominant political ideology in the West? And that's very much in a state of play. One of the big questions in Europe is whether or not the European Union and liberal democracies in the West and Eastern Europe can continue to be substantively liberal, and whether or not they will change to an illiberal democratic model. Now, the United States kind of even is having trouble with that right now. That's also an open question here. I think the United States will be okay, just because liberal democratic culture is so ingrained, not only in political culture, but is also tied so closely to just everyday life, everyday culture. Anglo-Saxon culture in general is predisposed towards smaller government and democratic institutions. May not always, sometimes it abuses them, but it does prefer those institutions to alternatives. I don't know that the culture is as well ingrained in certain parts of Europe. So that, I think, the political side of that question about what's going to happen over the next few decades because of structural economic changes, I think that's kind of the more near-term question. What will happen with liberal democracy? Is a liberal democracy the future? Oh, somebody's asking if I think banks are too big to fail. No, they're not. Banks are not too big to fail. But also, I would point out that's a very subjective answer. Whatever answer you get from that says a lot about the person answering. So on the one hand, yeah, you could argue that they are too big to fail, that banking institutions are so important to the economy that if they were allowed to collapse, that it would be catastrophic, and that whatever the cost of bailing them out may be, that cost would be lower than not bailing them out. On the other hand, you can argue that by bailing them out, you're creating a principal agent problem. Or not a principal agent problem, what am I thinking of? Oh, the name escapes me. But you're creating a problem wherein, by bailing them out, you set a precedent. And if they think they're going to get bailed out in the future, they'll take more risks than they would have otherwise. And you'll have more systematic risks and probably more frequent financial crises. So in that sense, it's a bad idea to bail out banks, even if they're very large, and even the damage of letting them fail would be very substantial. So kind of depends on your perspective, kind of depends on how much risk you want in your financial sector, and how much economic dislocation you're willing to take from a banking collapse.
Kind of depends on if you're a bank.
Yeah. Yeah, if you're a bank, you have very definitive opinions on the issue. So somebody named Jim Rogers is predicting the biggest crash since the Great Depression in the next 2 years. Oh, he's an investor predicting that. And he's asking why. I don't know. I haven't heard of Jim Rogers, and I haven't heard that prediction. There's no shortage of prognosticators, people in the financial industry who make predictions, and you can always find somebody who thinks the next big downturn is around the corner. You can also find people who think that the economy is going to explode and do really well in this future. So I'm not sure what his argumentation is. I would have to see what his argument is, why he thinks that would happen, to comment on that. I haven't seen a lot of data about that. I have heard an argument that there's going to be a recession within the next couple years because just because of the business cycle. The United States, at least, has been growing almost continually since 2010, I think, and it's actually technically in one of the longest periods of growth in its history. Doesn't really feel like it, but technically it is. So just because of the business cycle, just because upturns are always followed by downturns, some people are saying that, all right, in the next couple of years, there's almost certainly going to be an economic downturn. But I haven't heard or seen a lot of data or argumentation kind of into that, so I would have to see Mr. Rogers' analysis to kind of get an idea of what he is getting at. So somebody is asking about Russia is cited as the one that broke the German front and allowed Allied forces to win the war. Why did Stalin turn on the Allies? Let me think. Yeah, there was a couple of years after World War II ended in which the alliance with the Soviet Union kind of held, in which there was kind of a de facto understanding that, all right, you guys are over there, you've got your sphere of influence. We're over here, we've got our stuff, so let's all just be chill and cool. One of the big problems faced in the immediate after the war was what to do with Germany. And there had been an agreement before the war ended on that account. It was decided that Germany would be deindustrialized and reduced to a largely agricultural economy. Excuse me. And it was also decided that Germany would be a neutral state. It would be it would not align with either the West or the Soviet Union, and it would basically act as a buffer state between Soviet-controlled territories and the West. So that was the agreement anyway. After the war ended, the actual implementation of that agreement encountered some problems. And disagreements about the details of the implementation of that plan are kind of the root of the divide that emerged between the Soviets and the West after World War II and eventually evolved into the Cold War. You know, one of the problems was that the Soviets implemented central planning in their zone of Germany, in their occupation zone. And there had been no agreement about what the economic system of occupied Germany would be, or what would become an independent buffer state. And when the Soviets unilaterally imposed central planning, that was considered an aggressive move on the part of the West. They didn't think it meant they were breaking the agreement, but there was a lot of suspicion that maybe the Soviets weren't going to honor the agreement, that Germany would be a neutral state. They thought maybe they would try to impose communism, and then maybe later on, when Germany became that independent buffer state, in which there would be no foreign troops deployed, they thought maybe the communists would make a move and try to take over. And at that point, you would have a communist Germany that would just naturally ally with the Soviet Union. So the implementation of central planning was very suspicious. It made the Western allies very suspicious. On the part of the Soviets, they were very upset when the Western allies started reneging on the part of the plan that involved deindustrializing Germany. One of the problems with the deindustrialization plan is that there just was not enough work in the agricultural sector to absorb all of the former industrial workers in Germany. And the result was that there was a huge number of unemployed people who were starving, and they didn't know what to do with them. And eventually it was decided that, we can't just let them all die off. The Soviets would have been happy to, they didn't mind as much. But and the Western allies were concerned about that. And, I don't mean to kind of sound like I'm biased against the Soviet Union. I'm not saying the Soviets were heartless bastards and the Allies were just so good and wholesome that they didn't want to let all these people starve. But, on the part of the Western Allies, For one, they didn't think it was reasonable to expect all those people to starve. But two, they were also worried about a revolt. If you just let people starve to death, then eventually there's going to be some shit. And given that World War II had just ended, there was no desire on the part of the Allies to fight a major insurrection in Germany. So partly it was done just to pacify the German public. There was also a creeping suspicion that if the German public were sufficiently discontented, they would turn to communism. Communism would become popular, and then communism would kind of take over that way. So, part humanitarian concern, part strategic interest, and part just politics, part just general interest in maintaining the peace. For those reasons, they backed off of the deindustrialization plan in Western Germany, in the parts of Germany that were occupied by the U.S., Britain, and France anyway. The Soviets saw that as very suspicious because they thought that it implied that maybe the West was going to try to prop up Germany as an anti-Soviet state and act as a bulwark against communism, and that it maybe wouldn't be as neutral as the agreement had implied. So suspicious moves like that kind of undermined trust between the two sides eventually hardened positions, and it made it difficult for the two sides to negotiate on those issues. They would meet and negotiate, oh, hey, you implemented central planning in your zone, we don't want to do that. What is the economy of the eventual unified Germany going to look like? And because so much suspicion had been built up in those talks, no agreement could be made. And as the negotiations dragged on over a number of years, eventually it just became a de facto permanent state of affairs. So the divide of Germany into West and East Germany was never intended to be permanent. Germany was actually supposed to be unified within 5 to 10 years after the war ended, as I understand it. But because no agreement could be made on exactly what that would look like, East Germany and West Germany kind of split off and became de facto permanent states. And that kind of was the root, really, of the Soviet antagonism to the West and Western suspicion of Soviet motives. I'm sure there were other factors as well. I'm an amateur guy, amateur historian, so this is just what I've read. I'm sure somebody who's read more professional could tell you many more variables and factors. I would encourage you to go out, if you're interested in this, to go out and find other sources, better sources than me. How widespread was the use of chemical weapons in World War II? The impression of World War II that there were no chemical weapons. That's not actually accurate. Chemical weapons were used. It was just relatively limited, certainly compared to World War I. In the case of I don't think they were ever used in the Western Front. In terms of Britain, France, and Germany, I don't think it was ever used there. I don't think it was ever even really used significantly on the Eastern Front. There is one exception. There was a massive, actually in Crimea. In the Crimea, the Russians have a huge naval base that they built there. That is the headquarters of their Black Sea Fleet. It's at a city called, I'll probably mispronounce it. It's called Sevastopol. I think that's how it's pronounced. And when the Germans kind of blew through the Ukraine in 1941, they got hung up on Sevastopol. It was heavily fortified, and the city/fortress held out for something like 6 months under German siege. And finally, the Germans just said, "Fuck it, we're sick of this," and they dumped a bunch of resources into that particular area, and went all out on Sevastopol. But before they did that, the first stage of that attack was to kind of overrun the fortress complex and then pump a bunch of chemicals into the fortress, because it was thought that cleaning it out would just be too costly in terms of man. The Soviets would just drag it out and it would be hugely costly. So instead of actually sending people into the fortress and fighting, hand to hand, room to room, they just pumped a shit ton of gas into the fortress complex and gassed the defenders inside. I think that was the most extensive use of chemical weapons in World War II. I'm assuming that you're talking specifically about the military side and not about the Holocaust. Obviously, in the Holocaust, a great deal of chemicals were used. Just in terms of military to military fighting, yeah, not that extensive in Europe. Now, in China, it was completely different. The Japanese had no qualms about using chemical weapons there in that theater, and I don't think people aren't as familiar with the Chinese theater of World War II because there aren't as many sources. You know, China was basically isolated and cut off from the West because of the Chinese Civil War and because the communists won and isolated themselves. So not as much is known, but in the Second Sino-Japanese War, in that theater, the Japanese were quite happy to use not only chemical weapons, but also biological weapons. One of the nasty things they did I think it was in the Battle of Chengdu, but I also think they did it more broadly, especially in the Sichuan Basin where the Chinese government was located. They actually infected these, I think they were fleas, with bubonic plague. And they loaded up a whole slew of bombers with them, with these little, delivery devices filled with them, and they just dumped them on Chinese lines and sort of on Chinese cities. And there were, unsurprisingly, there was a big outbreak of the plague in China during that period, owing to that. Yeah, it was very ugly, the war in China. It's actually a really interesting study. Am I talking too much? Did you have some input?
No, I mean, this method has made it sort of more direct, where people can basically just get the questions to you, and Pact has been super fast about getting the good ones, lining them up. People are enjoying
Gotcha.
it. Interesting stuff. Very interesting story, John. Nice. People are having a good time. This is chill for me. I'm just getting to kind of be quiet and play the game and have a good time, listen in.
Okay. Let's see. Do you think that America's massive amount of land affects their position in global politics? Yeah, definitely. Actually, I was thinking about this just recently, in fact. So the Soviet Union was seen as being, during the Cold War, was seen as being not more powerful than the United States, but having an immense amount of resources. It had a larger population than the United States. It had more land than the United States, and so it was kind of colored as this, titanic enemy, this giant beast that loomed over Europe. But if you look at the United States and Canada together, this is a little bit of a tangent, but the United States and Canada together actually have about the same amount of land as the Soviet Union did. And it actually had about the same amount of people. And at the same time that they had roughly the same land area and demographic side, they had a much larger economy. So, yeah, I would say land area definitely affects the geopolitical position in the world. The United States has access to resources that it does not have to go abroad and seek. Japan has to import an enormous amount of resources because it's a resource-poor country. But here in the United States, we kind of have a lot of what we need here. That we still import quite a bit, but the reason the United States imports quite a bit isn't because we don't produce enough. It's more because we have so much. Well, yeah, it is because we produce a lot. We produce so much stuff, basically, that we can't produce enough inputs to produce it with. And so as a result, we have to go afield. It isn't because we're a resource-poor country like Japan. And that creates a lot of stability for America's strategic position. We don't have to worry as much about supply lines or even our relations with other countries as much. A lot of America's defense strategy, is not centered on defending direct threats to the United States. It's designed on preventing the emergence of direct threats to the United States. So American strategy is actually predicated on making sure potential threats to the United States are always 2 or 3 degrees removed from the homeland. So the United States deploys far afield in places like Europe, the Middle East, and Japan, and etc., in order to ensure that strategic rivals are very far away and stay very far away. And we're partly able to do that because we do have so many resources here, because the economy is so large, because our demographics and natural resources do provide immense resources with which to do that, with which to build a large military and project power with it overseas. It's kind of a rambling answer. A lot of these are rambling answers on my part. I apologize for not being the best at communication.
Apology accepted. It's cool. You're better at speaking than pretty much everyone here, so it's all good. You're not being graded.
What was the cause of the Cold War? Actually, we kind of talked about that already with Germany. That was a big instigating factor. There was also a lot of political discontent in the West when people saw that the Soviet Union was... The assumption was that they were forcing communism on a lot of Eastern European countries. And that was especially disturbing in the case of Czechoslovakia, which had actually been one of the, maybe the only stable democracy in Eastern Central Europe before World War II started. And so watching communists seize control there was particularly disturbing for Westerners. They felt it was a kind of great betrayal of their allies, and in Czechoslovakia it was almost like a second Munich to them. That's not really entirely a fair criticism. I don't know how much the broader public at the time realized that part of the agreement made at Yalta was that the world would be separated into spheres of influence and that the Soviets would kind of have a free hand in Eastern Europe. That was just sort of the cost of having a stable post-war situation. But that was very disconcerting and put pressure on Western governments to kind of be more active. You know, if people were less trusting of the Soviets on that account. That's kind of the power of PR and perception. But the concerns about the future of Germany and what that would look like, that was probably one of the principal factors. There was also a sense that, keep in mind this is a pre-internet era we're talking about. If you wanted information about what's going on in countries and political groups and what they're doing, it was really hard to get that information. And so there was a lot more uncertainty in terms of devising strategy in international relations. So one of the suspicions was lingering from the 1920s was that communists all over the world were influenced or directed by Moscow. And that kind of stemmed from an institution that was called the Comintern, that the Bolsheviks created after the Russian Civil War, that, was actually designed to organize other communist movements in other countries. I think the Comintern was actually disbanded in the early 30s. But because of that, there was a lingering suspicion in the West that the Soviets were still had strong ties to other communist movements and were using them as their proxies. And the degree to which that was true, there was no way to be sure. There was no good way to be certain. I mean, the Bolsheviks were very good at espionage, were very good at subterfuge. And Western intelligence agencies were kind of put at a disadvantage because they could not quite discern the extent to which the Soviets were acting through these movements. And because of that, there was that in and of itself greatly increased suspicion of the Soviet Union and its plans for the world, for foreign policy. You know, keep in mind also that the Soviet Union was a totalitarian government, especially during its Stalinist period. And that the perception in the West was that Stalinist Russia was basically Nazi Germany and had the same expansionist impulses. You know, in 1939, the Germans had signed an agreement, a non-aggression pact with the Soviets. That was very shocking. But they had reached an agreement and divided Poland between themselves. The Soviets had the Eastern Poland and the Germans had Western Poland. And also the Soviets during that period, I think in 1940, had tried to invade Finland during the Winter War. That was an interesting conflict in and of itself, actually. And the Soviets also strong-armed Romania into handing over the territory called Moldova. I think they called it Bessarabia at the time. So there was a sense that the Soviets were an expansionist government in the same vein as the Germans, and that if the Western Allies did not take a strong line against the Soviet Union, that they would, in the same way that the Germans had, would slowly creep across Europe incrementally, kind of expanding slowly like the Germans had been trying to do with the Sudetenland and the Saar Valley, getting the Czech Republic, or rather Western Czechoslovakia, you know, at Munich. That was the perspective of Western leaders at that time. And so looking at a totalitarian regime that has shady links to movements all over the world, especially in Europe, that made national security leaders so suspicious that they thought, all right, well, given that the stakes are so high, another world war, we really need to crack down. We cannot allow communist movements to proliferate. We cannot allow the Soviets to think that they can expand this way. We have to ensure that they know that if they do this, that they will receive a strong response. And as part of as part of sending that signal that there would be a strong response, Westerners formed NATO, they formed military alliances, and eventually they even integrated West Germany into NATO. And all of that was very threatening to the Soviet Union. They saw, and actually Russians still today, see NATO as an organization explicitly aimed at them. And the Russian perspective was that, okay, they're gearing up for an invasion. They're all linking up because they hate communism and they want to come and get us. And that fear was compounded when West Germany was integrated into NATO in 1954, I think, about 6-7 years after NATO was formed. Because the thinking was that, all right, whatever the Allies do, everybody still hates Germany, right? And we all still mistrust the Germans. Surely they're not going to let the Germans into their military alliance. And when West Germany was integrated, that removed all doubt for the Russians that that was an alliance explicitly aimed at them. There was a lot of debate about allowing West Germany into NATO, even among Western countries. You know, for a while, NATO was as much aimed at Germany as it was the Soviet Union. There was a fear that, you know, maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but eventually Germany would become a power again. And if that day ever came, they wanted to make sure they had a military alliance in place to fight them. The Soviet threat kind of eclipsed that concern. And as a result of that, because of that greater overriding concern about a potential Soviet invasion or Soviet subterfuge, West Germany was eventually integrated, much to the chagrin of the French. So that was kind of the genesis, the initial genesis of the Cold War. And really, how the Cold War started, that's an ongoing debate in history. And it's an interesting subject to read. There are a lot of different opinions about it. You'll get a lot of different perspectives. And, you know, I'm just telling you the things I remember. I mean, there's a whole slew of different factors to consider that other sources that you could read about in other sources. So, yeah, very interesting topic, definitely. Oh, why did communism act as such a dividing strategy? Why were allies so absolutely against communism in all forms? I basically just, it was the uncertainty. They didn't know the degree to which the Soviets were supporting it or not. And there was a kind of a debate about, all right, so to what degree do we allow communism as a competing political force to operate in our society? And eventually it was decided that the prospect of a third world war that they assumed, you know, could happen as a result of the Soviets using communist parties in Europe as their avatar. That stake was considered too high to really allow communists to flourish. And so for that reason, communism, yeah, like I said, for that reason, there was very little tolerance of communism in Western Europe. Oh, God.
Oh, God.
There's a trade surplus question. So this guy is asking about the trade surplus Germany has with the United States. He's specifically asking about it in the context of the President Trump, criticizing Germany for having a surplus. Yeah, so there's nothing wrong with running a trade surplus. And a lot of economists will criticize Germany for doing that because they think that it creates imbalances. I don't think imbalances are really as big a deal in Germany's case because it is kind of a smaller country. You know, if you look at Europe, it forms a singular economic entity. So most of Germany's surplus comes from trading with other countries in Europe. It's not so much with the United States. But most of that trade surplus just stems from Europe. So Europe as a whole is one economic entity. So complaining about Germany having a surplus is kind of like complaining about California in the United States having a trade surplus with other states. I don't think anybody complains about that over here. And I don't think it's fair to criticize Germany basically on the same grounds. Economists criticize Germany because they think Germany goes out of its way to have a trade surplus and tries to skews its policy in favor of that. And they think that it should do the opposite, that the German government should spend more money and that that the government should do more to increase wages in Germany, so that there is more consumption. And they think that would even out differences in Europe in terms of economic development. They think that if Germany consumed more, that there would be more demand that other countries in Europe could sell to, and that would float the economies of these other European countries. In the case of the United States, Germany has a surplus just because they have a lot of stuff. They produce a lot of high-end, high-value goods, and they don't import as much from the United States because there's not as much there. I'm sure there's a lot in terms of finance. The United States is one of the financial centers of the world, and I'm sure most of the imports the United States, or rather most of the exports the United States makes to Germany, are probably in that form. Technically, when you're if you're in finance, and somebody sends you money, somebody invests money in your bank or financial institution, technically that counts as an export. So whenever you send money to a bank in London and ask them to invest it for you, that's a British export, technically, because that's money coming into Britain. And in the same way, the United States, quote unquote, exports to Germany financial services by way of Germans investing their money in American investment banks. Yeah, I don't think it would solve anything to reduce the German trade surplus with the United States, because I don't know what they would do. I mean, I don't know how you would even start to do that without distorting the economy. I mean, the surplus exists there for a reason. American consumers rather want German products, and American goods just aren't as competitive in a lot of cases, and have trouble competing in the European market writ large. Keep in mind, when you're talking about American goods competing in Germany, what you're really talking about is American goods competing in Europe, because the European Union as a whole is a singular economic market. That's one market. That was the whole point of the European Union. And I think also another important point, and I kind of just talked about it, there's a difference between current accounts deficits and reserve accounts deficits. Both of those combined determine a country's balance of payments. And when people talk about a trade surplus, they're almost always talking about current accounts, which exclusively focuses on trade in goods. So tangible goods like trucks, cars, guns, whatever you like. The reserve account refers to trade in intangible goods, things like financial products. And if you look at the current accounts deficit of the United States, it's relatively large. But if you look at the reserve account in the United States actually generates a huge reserve accounts surplus. And so combined, the balance of payments in the United States is actually still a deficit, but it's relatively narrow, because the reserve accounts surplus actually covers a lot of that current accounts deficit. So a lot of the complaining in the United States about the current accounts deficit and the surplus with Germany, that's kind of a very manufacturing-centered complaint. People in the manufacturing sector in the United States have been hurting for a while. Not really hurting, actually. It's just employment has been falling. Because of automation, fewer and fewer people are employed in manufacturing relative to the rest of the economy. And those people are of the mind that international trade is one of the major contributing factors to the decline in unemployment, so they push hard. They push hard for the United States to get other countries to buy more American goods. So just because that's a major voting bloc for Trump and a lot of people on, what would you call, I guess, the anti-globalist, populist political movement, whatever you want to call that, because that's a major voting bloc for them and for Trump, he kind of couches international trade talks in those terms. So when he talks to Germany, he doesn't talk about the balance of payments, but that doesn't have as much of a resonance with his voters, with manufacturing workers, with industrial workers. So that's a really long-winded answer, and I guess basically the answer is politics. The reason that it comes up a lot is because of political considerations in the United States. Domestic industrial workers are upset about having fewer and fewer employment prospects, and they partly, kind of wrongly, blame international trade for that, and what they see as unfair trade imbalances propagated by countries like Germany, which have persistent trade surpluses. Yeah, trade surpluses, and that's a whole nother topic of discussion, kind of how that comes about. But yeah, basically that's my answer to that, if that makes any sense at all. Oh, he also asks, so if at all, what is the direction that this needs to be addressed? Like I said, it's not really a direction that it's not really something that needs to be addressed. Germany could do more to buy more, but that would mostly serve to reduce the deficit with other European countries, not with the United States. So again, it's largely a political consideration on the part of the Trump administration to make it an issue at all. I don't think Germany can do a lot to do anything about it, and I don't think they will do anything about it. They could do something symbolic to placate the Trump administration. That's more likely, but I think even there, that wouldn't look very good on the part of German politicians, because the Trump administration is so unpopular over in Europe. So I don't think doing him any favors is going to win any points in any German election. So let's see. Is it accurate to say that using nuclear weapons on Japan cost the Japanese fewer casualties than they would have had accrued in a war of attrition to force their surrender, given widespread imperial commitment? Probably, yeah. The nuclear weapons and their use on Japan are kind of seen as atrocities by some people, but that's not entirely fair. For one, they did kind of help end the war. That's why Japan surrendered. That's its own interesting topic. I think I've talked to you, Neuro, about that a couple times.
Yep.
But yeah, I mean, an invasion of Japan would have been hugely destructive. I think, yeah, exactly. I think the projection on the part of the U.S. War Department, or the Joint Chiefs of Staff, or whatever it was at the time, was that an invasion of Japan would cost the United States something on the order of 500 to 600,000 casualties, which is a lot. Keep in mind, the United States over the course of World War II only lost about, 250,000 to 300,000 casualties. So invading Japan would have significantly increased those casualties, if I'm remembering this right anyway. But yeah, an invasion of Japan would have been hugely destructive, not only to the United States in terms of soldiers lost, material lost, it also would have been massively destructive to Japan. I mean, Japan already had it pretty bad as was, but with an invasion, I mean, it just would have been, I mean, the thinking in the US was that it would be an Iwo Jima from one end of Japan to the other. And if you know anything about the Battle of Iwo Jima, you know how brutal that was. So, yeah, using the nuclear weapons, and in so much as they helped induce Japan to surrender sooner, yeah, that definitely probably saved lives. Japan, kind of on a tangent from that, Japan had seen significant damage from American bombing raids in 1944 and 1945. Partly that was because Japanese cities were mostly made of wood and paper, and so they were very easily set alight. And the United States, because we're clever like that, we started using these incendiary devices instead of bombs in what were called firebombing raids. And the idea was we would use these incendiary devices and these mass attacks, just drop them in mass all over Japanese cities, specifically just to start fires. So there were still conventional bombing raids, but these firebombing raids in particular were very effective. And the firestorms that were caused by the subsequent conflagrations were massive and hugely destructive. In fact, if you look at pictures of the damage done to Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the cities are just absolutely flattened. A lot of that damage was from the initial explosion of the bomb, but actually a good amount of the damage also came from the subsequent fires, which burned out of control. And you don't need a nuclear bomb to do that, So the most destructive bombing raid on Japan during the war was not actually Hiroshima or Nagasaki. It was actually a large-scale firebombing raid on Tokyo in 1945 that killed well over 100,000 people. And I think Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the casualties were more around 80 to 90,000 people, I think, if I'm remembering correctly. So if you're Japanese high command and you're hearing just regularly, you're getting regular reports about cities being obliterated, burned to the ground by these bombing raids, it probably doesn't necessarily faze you that much that, oh, this time they destroyed a city, but they used one bomb. Okay, that's interesting trivia, but it doesn't really change the pattern, right? They've already been eradicating city after city, so it doesn't really change your calculus that much. And the reason that's significant is that there's a strong argument to be made that the bombs didn't really induce Japan to surrender. It was actually more another factor that came about at roughly the same time. About a couple of days after Hiroshima, after the nuclear bombing at Hiroshima, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. And that was actually very shocking for the Japanese, because in the year or two up to that point, they had been using the Soviet Union as a mediator between themselves and the United States, or were trying to get them to fulfill that role. Keep in mind that the Soviet Union had not been at war with Japan up until 1945. They were quite busy fighting the Germans, and the Japanese were busy fighting the China and the United States. And so when Japan started losing the war, they kind of sent out some feelers to the Soviet Union about making some kind of peace deal with the United States. And the Soviet Union kind of strung them along and kind of convinced them that, oh yeah, we can make a deal. There's a deal in the making. Just kind of hold out and you'll eventually get it. And so then for them, the Soviets then to turn around and declare war all of a sudden in 45 just completely obliterated the strategic position of Japan. You know, what their position was already weak, and having the Soviets enter the war, that pretty much reduced any chance they had of reaching a favorable settlement to zero. And also there was a huge fear amongst the Japanese elites, political, military, and economic, about communism. And it was thought that if a war with the Soviet Union continued, they would eventually basically have the opportunity to occupy Japan. And there was a fear basically that a good chunk of Japan would be occupied by the Soviet Union, kind of just like Korea was. And nobody in Japan was eager to see communism implemented in Japan. So fear of the Soviet Union and fear of communism were actually probably the more important factors inducing the Japanese to surrender. They knew they were going to lose. They were, to a degree, willing to fight to the death. At least, the military leaders were. But there was an overriding fear of communism. I mean, at least if they fight to the death, and Japan is just devastated by the prospective invasion of Japan, there would at least still be a Japan. They would at least still have their honor. But it was thought that if communism were implemented, that would completely destroy Japanese culture, and that there's no honor basically in communism. They thought communism was sort of the greater defilement of Japan than anything that would come from the destruction of Japan from an invasion. So for that reason, surrender was considered the lesser evil than having communism overrun the country, and they surrendered pretty quickly after that. Nagasaki was kind of incidental almost at that point. Yeah, the Soviets actually did get part of Japan. They, when they declared war, most of their war effort was focused on Manchuria, northeastern China, what is now northeastern China. And they blew through the Kwangtung Army, which was the Japanese Imperial Expeditionary Army deployed in China. To be fair to them, they didn't have their best units deployed in Manchuria. That had been kind of a quiet front up to that point. But the Red Army had cut its teeth for some years fighting the Wehrmacht, and was in prime condition, and so they sliced through the Japanese army very easily. But while that was happening, there was also a Soviet force that came down from the Soviet Far East and actually invaded the Kuril Islands and southern Sakhalin Island. And they occupied them pretty quickly, and they were poised to jump from the final island in the chain into Hokkaido, the northernmost of the major islands in Japan. And fortunately for the Japanese, the war ended before the Soviets could launch that invasion, before they could get into Hokkaido proper. But they were very close. In fact, the invasion force was pretty much set and ready to get the green light when the ceasefire was signed. Ceasefire was agreed to. And actually, one of the ongoing tensions between Russia and Japan, even today, and ever since the end of World War II, was what to do with those islands that the Soviets took at the end of World War II.
Good, man.
They're called the Kuril Islands, and the Russians actually still control them, but the Japanese also still claim them. So there's actually this ongoing territorial dispute over who should control these islands. I doubt the Russians will give them up, because the Russians are like that. But the Japanese don't want to let it go. I think we talked last Sunday about how conservative a lot of Japanese are, especially the right wing of Japanese politics are.
Yep.
So I don't think it's I don't think it's likely that the Japanese will ever quite give up that claim. But a little bit of trivia for you, actually, because of that dispute, the Soviet Union and subsequently Russia never signed a peace treaty with Japan. So technically, World War II never ended. technically, the Russians are still at war with Japan. You know, they're still using that armistice that they signed in order to cease hostilities, but a proper peace treaty was never signed.
Got a donation for the two of us. Nice.
Oh, somebody wanted to know more about the invasion of Finland. Yeah, the Winter War. That was a neat little conflict. You know, the Soviets were the heavy favorites. And it was thought that they would roll over the Finns because it was such a smaller country. You know, a little bit of background, Finland used to be a part of Russia. For about 100 plus years, it was a part of the Russian Empire. And then Finland, along with a number of other countries on the western frontier of what had been the Russian Empire, achieved independence after World War I. Ukraine for a while, the Baltic countries, and Finland all got their independence from the Russian Empire during that, after World War I and the chaos that followed. You know, that's also a very weird, interesting period. But unlike the other countries, Finland was never conquered again. The Baltic countries were conquered pretty easily, almost without a shot fired, in 1940. Moldova, which had been part of Russia, was annexed by Romania, the Romanian-speaking population. I think I mentioned before that the Russians forced the Romanians to give that back to them also, I think, in 1940. So invading Finland was kind of an extension of that. That wasn't technically the excuse that the Soviets used. The Soviets rationalized it by saying that the Finnish border was too close to Leningrad, modern-day St. Petersburg. And it was pretty close. So their rationale was that they wanted more land, basically more of a buffer zone between Leningrad and the Finnish border. And so on that pretext, they attacked Finland in 1940. And what was it, late 1940, winter 1940. And the Soviets performed very poorly. For one, they attacked in the winter when it was very cold. You might think that the Soviets would have an advantage, because there's this impression that the Soviets are very good winter fighters. That's not entirely deserved. The Soviet advantage in the Eastern Front in World War II, fighting during winter, did not owe so much to some kind of innate superiority in winter fighting. It owed more to the fact that the Germans were just very unprepared for winter fighting. Certainly in 1941, the German army did not have any winter gear. It was thought that the war would be over before winter happened, and so none of them had any of the necessary kit. And so also, the Soviets not only had the necessary kit, one of the reasons the Soviets were able to turn things around at the Battle of Moscow in 1941, in December, I think it was that a good chunk, I think it was almost like half of the Red Army, all the way through up until December 41, was deployed in the Soviet Far East, because they were concerned about Japan invading. They thought that there was a good chance Japan would invade and that they would need half of their army to fight them off. So, to be fair to the Soviets, they were kind of fighting 1941 with one hand tied behind their back in Siberia. So one of the reasons the Soviets did so well in the winter there in 41 around Moscow is because all of those Siberian troops, which obviously had winter gear being in Siberia, those were all transferred west in order to help relieve Moscow. So not only were the Germans completely unprepared in terms of kit, the Soviets had the necessary kit and sent in a whole shit ton of units that were just very, very prepared for winter fighting. Subsequent winter fighting in the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front was not as one-sided. You generally didn't see it be as bad as it was for the Germans in 41, because after that they actually did have winter kit. So in 1939, the Soviets went in, and they were nominally prepared for winter fighting, but they were not as prepared as the Finns were. And the Finns were much better at it than they were. And one of the things the Finns did is use mobility. They had ski troops, for example, who could go from one area to another very quickly, and ambush Soviet forces as they pushed into Finland. The Finns also had a very strong defensive line. There's to the north of Leningrad, where a lot of the fighting initially was, there's an isthmus. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. There's a big lake called, I think it's Lake Ladoga. And then to the west of the isthmus is the Baltic Sea. So Soviet forces advancing into Finland from Leningrad were kind of bottlenecked into this isthmus. And so the Finns were able to kind of turn that into a killing zone, and were able to shut down the Soviet offensive in that area pretty quickly. They were able to hold them off for several months like that, and everybody in the world was completely shocked by that. They couldn't believe that the Soviet Union, this giant country, was getting eaten alive by this little Finnish army. The Soviets were eventually able to break the deadlock by attacking further east, where the Russian border with Finland is broader. And attacking that frontier, the Finns they didn't have as much of a natural defensive line, and so they were eventually forced back. And that is what eventually forced them to surrender. I don't know, maybe nobody knows, maybe somebody more versed in the history of the conflict than me. I don't know if the Soviets ever intended to fully annex Finland like they did the Baltic states. Maybe if they had had more success, they would have, regardless. But as was, the Soviets were humiliated by the conflict, even though they ended up winning, getting a favorable settlement. And the Finns, for their part, were able to retain their independence, but they had to give up very good-sized tracts of their territory to the Soviets as part of that agreement. And Finland used to have access to the Arctic Ocean. They used to have a little sliver of territory up there, and that ended up going to Russia, territory that the Russians kept after the war. The other thing that the Russians forced them to do was give them access to a port. They forced them to lease the port of, I think it was called Hanko to them. And so there was this little Finnish port that had a Soviet naval base on it for the duration of the war, until the Germans kicked them out anyway. And then actually I think they had it throughout the Cold War as well. I think they did anyway. I don't think they have it anymore. I think the Finns terminated the lease after the Soviet Union collapsed in short order. But that was also, a little bit of an epilogue to that. Finland, because it had such bad relations with the Soviet Union because of the Winter War, and just because of concern that there would be another conflict with them at some point, actually allied with Nazi Germany. And when Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union, took off, it did so with the full cooperation of Finland. And that led to some bizarre circumstances, because Finland was not a fascist country. I think it had a nominal democracy. It might have had something of a military authoritarian regime because of General Mannerheim, but I don't recall whether or not Finland had its democracy or still had its authoritarian government at that point during the war. But regardless, it was much less authoritarian than Nazi Germany, certainly, and most of Germany's other satellite states. And it was not fascist explicitly, as I understand it. So one of the weird things that happened as a result of that is that Jewish soldiers in the Finnish army ended up fighting on the same side as Nazi Germany. There weren't a whole lot of Jewish soldiers in the Finnish army, but they were there. And there were a handful of rather awkward incidents where they had to kind of fight on the same side there, even in the same battle. So what a little trivia, some interesting trivia there. Let's see, so somebody's asking, can you ask why Australia and the USA became such close allies? And was it solely based upon its location in the Pacific? Not quite. It was more the arrangement Australia had before World War II in terms of its security, because Australia has historically been a very small country demographically. I think even today it only has, 20 to 30 million people, which is not very much given the sheer geographic size of the country. So they've always needed help in terms of their defense. They've always had, larger countries around them that are more threatening. before World War II, they leaned on Britain for their defense. You know, they were a part of the British Empire, and so one of the obligations of the United Kingdom was to provide for the defense of Australia as part of the Commonwealth. That arrangement fell apart with the initiation of World War II in the Pacific theater. The Japanese call it the Pacific War because they didn't participate in Europe, so for them it was just the Pacific War. So when Japan entered World War II, they pretty quickly knocked Britain out of the Pacific. And it was one of the more humiliating episodes in the history of the British military history. The British thought they would do okay. They had a significant military presence in India, and they had a pretty decent strong point in Singapore, which was relatively well fortified. The trouble for the British was that it was fortified from the sea. They weren't expecting a land invasion from the north, and that's kind of how the Japanese got them. The Japanese moved south through Thailand, a country which was nominally independent, but the Japanese strong-armed Thailand into giving them freedom of movement through their country. So the Japanese military moved south through Thailand and then staged landings in what is now northern Malaysia, or northern Malaya rather, and then they pushed south onto Singapore, and that caught the British off guard. They didn't have any defense for that basically, and so once the British garrison was surrounded by land and by sea, because the British naval squadron deployed there had been destroyed. Famously, there were two British battleships. I think they were called the Prince of Wales and the Repulse. Were both destroyed in a Japanese air raid. It was an early example in the war of air power destroying naval units. And so this naval squadron, the naval presence Britain had around Singapore, was crippled by that defeat. And so Singapore was surrounded by both land and sea, and as a result, the British garrison there had to surrender. And it was something like well over 100,000 British troops had to surrender. It's one of the largest defeats in British military history. And so, because of that, and as well as because of Japanese military operations in the Central Pacific and pushing into New Guinea and Indonesia, the British military position in the Pacific basically collapsed. And Australia was kind of out of luck. There wasn't really any good defense against further Japanese expansion, other than American help. They had to turn to the United States. And so at that point, from that point forward, Australia began cooperating very closely with the United States in terms of its national security. So that is the genesis of Australian-American relations, close Australian-American relations. They were already kind of close before that, just because of economic ties and cultural affinity. You know, they're both fundamentally Anglo-Saxon countries, so they're very similar in a lot of ways. But it was really World War II and Britain's defeat by Japan early in the war that really tied Australia closely to the United States and created that solid alliance. That's lasted ever since then. The United States has kind of been the principal provider of security for Australia, principal guarantor, rather, of security for Australia since then. So somebody is asking, how do you think the U.S.-Canada relations will turn out with the Trump administration? Yeah, I don't think anything dramatic will happen there, because I don't think Canada has a big trade surplus, and I don't think anybody blames Canada for America's economic ills over here, so I don't know that there will be a lot of pressure. The most dramatic thing I think the Trump administration has done thus far is try to curtail Canadian exports of lumber, because apparently there was some, I don't know, the Canadians did something with their lumber industry that the lumber industry over here in the U.S. was complaining about, that they thought gave them an unfair advantage. I don't know enough about it in detail to kind of give you an argument about whether or not that argument has merit, but I don't think, there's just not much there. I don't think the Trump administration sees much political opportunity in going after Canada. And the two countries are so tied economically that I think it would be disruptive for them to do anything. I think the biggest disruption that could come from the Trump administration with regard to Canada would be a renegotiation of NAFTA, which we talked a little bit about last Sunday. I think that would be the greater source of concern, but The only thing that's come of that so far is Trump kind of mentioning that he wants to initiate the process. I don't think he's even actually gone and done that, what's necessary to initiate the process of renegotiation. So once that process gets going, I think then that'll be the thing to watch in terms of U.S.-Canada relations. But until then, there's just not much going on. I wouldn't worry about it too much. Canada's not really on Trump's radar, I don't think.
Well, one of the things we talked about last time was, rather than him enacting a bunch of big things that have fundamentally changed America, it's more like him taking credit for stuff that kind of seems like things that he would do, rather than actually being a motivator for big changes.
Yeah, and I suspect that's part of what the lumber dispute is about. He's kind of throwing some red meat to the lumber industry out west in the western United States. I don't know if it'll stick or not, but it doesn't matter. You know, his voters are happy, and that's the principal reason that you do something like that. Uh-oh. Somebody's asking about the Iraq War. Let me see, what other contributing factors? So this person is of the mind that the petrodollar was one of the Saddam Hussein trying to undermine the petrodollar was one of the reasons the United States invaded Iraq in 2003. And he's asking what other contributing factors do you think there were? Yeah, kind of like I said earlier, I'm not a big follower of this line of reasoning that says the petrodollar is some cornerstone of American foreign policy. I think that's more a function of naturally occurring economic processes. There is some politics involved with it, but that's mostly predicated on just economics and trade. As far as Iraq, that's a tough question because the government was, as everybody knows, was very cagey about its reasons for invading Iraq. And, it may be that nobody ever knows really what the full reason was, what the logic behind it was. I think, we used to talk about this a lot in college, way back in the day, actually. And I think part of it was ideology. Keep in mind that a lot of people in the Bush administration, I think they famously became known as neocons, was kind of the pejorative name that people gave them. There were a lot of ideologues in the Bush administration that really thought that the proper way for the United States to behave in the world and to pursue its interests was to kind of follow the realist line of reasoning, that it should go out abroad, project force, and coerce either through political, economic, or military means other countries to fall into line, so to speak, and cater to American interests. And one of the ways those people thought that could work was through the democratization of Iraq. Not Iraq specifically, just democratization in general. There's this is also an ideological thing. There's this ideological assumption on the part of some people in the international relations field that democracies are natural allies, that democracies, quote unquote, never go to war with each other, which is not true, and the research on that is, flawed, to put it mildly. But, without getting too much into the flaws of that specific research, their line of reasoning was that if we turn Iraq into a democracy, they'll be a natural ally. And that'll end abuses by the totalitarian regime there, and it'll help curtail Islamic terrorism, because they won't have this dysfunctional government oppressing people. They'll have a free and open political system in which people can kind of combat extremist narratives. So I think part of the reason was democratization, and part of the reason was strategic considerations. The Saudis and the Gulf monarchies all hated Saddam Hussein. They all saw his regime and pan-Arab nationalism generally as a threat to their own monarchical form of government, so they'd always push the United States to take stronger action there. So, on the one hand, it removed a strategic rival of American allies in the region, but also it was an easy kill, so to speak. Iraq was very isolated. Iraq had no real allies, so they didn't really have any deterrence, so to speak. There was no large Iraqi military. There was no great and powerful Iraqi military ally that could come to their aid. They were so isolated that it was thought, okay, well, there's no real cost to this. So the low cost combined with ideological considerations within the Bush administration I think was kind of more the real genesis of it, more so than a desire for oil or to preserve the petrodollar. There's another factor too I used to talk about back in the day. What was it? Yeah, I'm slipping my mind. But roughly speaking, that's kind of more what it was. It was not a well thought out campaign. The planning was really bad. I'd kind of assumed when I was a kid at the time that surely the United States government will have a game plan for once the war is over. And lo and behold, it really didn't. And that alone was a big cause for the subsequent discontent. Yeah, another factor actually was the war on terrorism. That kind of opened up the way for the Bush administration to push that. I don't really think the Bush administration thought that the Iraqi government was like a big backer of Al-Qaeda or terrorism generally. I think that was more a pretext that they used. And I think the chemical weapons thing also was a pretext. There was a better argument there for intervention in terms of the Iraqi chemical and nuclear weapons program. But, it turned out not to be true, for one, and they probably knew it wasn't true even then. So I think mostly that was also a pretext. So I think, yeah, ideological and strategic considerations, in my opinion, were probably the leading factors in terms of the U.S. involvement in Iraq in 2003. Yeah, that's a very complex topic. You could kind of go all day with something like that. Oh, somebody's actually asking about Alaska.
Someone cares.
What were the factors that Russia sold Alaska? Well, what were the factors explaining why Russia sold Alaska to the U.S. and opinion on the short-sightedness of Russia in giving up what proves to be such an important and strategic land? Alaska was not seen as being really worth anything at that time. And really it wasn't worth anything up until maybe the mid-20th century. I think the most dramatic thing to happen in Alaska in the early 20th century, late 19th century, was the gold rush around 1900, the Klondike gold rush, I think it was. Other than that, it was very quiet, and there wasn't really much going on there. When Russia sold Alaska to the United States in 1866, I want to say, 67, it would have been right after the U.S. Civil War, I believe. And the president who bought it was named Andrew Johnson, and he was actually a wildly unpopular president. He was the guy who became president after the United States, after Lincoln was assassinated. And part of the reason he was so unpopular was because Lincoln, when he had run in the previous election, had wanted a Southern candidate to be his vice president. Because he was, Lincoln's whole thing was reconciliation and reunification. So he wanted a Southern candidate to try to appeal to what were called, neutral states. The name slips my mind. Basically states that were kind of Southern but had sided with the Union. So he wanted to appeal to them. And so Andrew Johnson, he had Andrew Johnson as his running mate. So when Lincoln was assassinated, Andrew Johnson, a Southerner, became president right after the Civil War had ended. And that did not sit well with a lot of people in the United States at all. A lot of people were very angry with the South because of the Civil War. And so Johnson became a punching bag for them for a while he was in office. But the Russians came to him with an offer of Alaska for not that much. It was actually a pretty good deal. It was like cents on a couple of cents per acre, like $1 an acre or something like that. Very cheap. And a lot of people shit on Johnson because Alaska was seen as having no value. It was thought, this is an ice box. This is just frozen land. There's nothing up there. Why should the United States government spend all this money to buy that? What an idiot. Why would he do that? And for Johnson's part, he just thought it was, why not? It's a good deal. The land is cheap. Let's just have it. And the Russians, for their part, just wanted cash. And I don't quite remember the state of Russian politics during that period to remember what the genesis of that was. I think it was something to do with reforms that Tsar Alexander had implemented. This was right at around the time when I think it was Tsar Alexander anyway, was going through his early reform period of his rule. And this is when the Russian serfs were freed, finally. And I think that was causing problems with the economy. There was some reforms with the economy that were causing trouble related to Tsar Alexander's reform program. And the Russian government needed or wanted money to deal with it. And selling Alaska, I think, was part of that. Again, I don't remember exactly. I wish I did. But I think that was the genesis. So at that time, it just was not strategic territory at all. You know, there were no airplanes or, you know, long range, you know. There was none of that stuff that made Alaska important later at that time in the 1860s. So the Russians didn't really think they were giving up anything. The most valuable thing in Alaska at that time was actually furs. The fur trade was a big part of the economy for a long time, and then even that was an important. Well, what happened was the fur trade collapsed finally after several centuries in the mid-19th century. And it wasn't that much, it was only like 10, 15 years, I think, before the Russians sold Alaska that the fur trade collapsed. So the one thing that made Alaska worth having in the 1860s was the money they got from the fur trade, and then once the fur trade was gone, it was worthless. The Russians really got nothing from it, and they weren't using it for anything, so yeah, they figured why not just sell it and make some quick cash. There actually is a political party in Russia that wants Alaska back. It's called the Liberal Democratic Party. And the name is funny because that party is neither liberal nor democratic. It's a rabid right-wing nationalist party.
Democratic Republic of the Congo.
Yeah, kind of in that vein. And part of their platform, there are other things that are easily more important in their party platform, but one of the things is that they want to demand Alaska back. I don't think they're going to get it, but that is something that they want.
Oh, cool. I'm not sure if there were additional questions or if Pact has kind of sealed off the valve, because we're right around 8 hours for today's stream. Let's see. Is that the deal? Today's been fun though. So